From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $55 million studio on the Pro Wrestle Machine. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. May 24, 1999 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. ECW Hardcore Heaven WWF No Mercy Reviews. More. By Observer staff. Amidst rumors flying everywhere of the possible demise of the company and others who are talking that the company is a short period away from growing bigger than ever, the ECW Hardcore Heaven pay-per-view came off like a show that was a bridge for the company to something new, but when it was over, there were still no answers over whether what is new is good news or bad news. It is hardly a secret that ECW is plagued with financial problems. There are wrestlers owed large sums of money. Those close to Shane Douglas, whose departure from the company, while expected, came out day earlier than expected, resulting in him no-showing the pay-per-view, is rumored to be owed in excess of $80,000. Some reports have that figure at $100,000. The stories about the bounced checks are legion. There are some really strange stories about finances, including the often asked question of how the company met payroll and never seemed to have any problems when drawing a few hundred fans a show a few years back, but now is bouncing checks left and right while drawing packed houses in admittedly small buildings and with merchandise way up. It is also no secret that ECW has been desperately trying to make deals that would save the company, and that Paul Heyman, after giving many different stories early, has largely said that certain deals are imminent that would make the company bigger than ever. At press time, none of those deals have gone down, but some are expected to be finalized shortly. With the new fall television seasons being finalized this month, it's assumed that any deal involving cable networks will either sink or swim over the next 2 weeks. The most talked about potential deal is to garner a weekly 1-hour time slot at 8 p.m. on the Nashville network. Multi-channel news had reported that this would be announced at the pay-per-view, although Paul Heyman said when that story broke that it wasn't the case. Nevertheless, crunch time on that decision is now. Heyman also said the much-talked-about Acclaim video deal should be finalized this week. Coming out of the show, most of the talk regarded the departure of Douglas, Troy Martin, who joins Axel Rotten, Brian Knighton, Chris Candido, and Tammy Sytch, the latter of whom did appear on the show but were buried early and swiftly in that regard. It was no secret that Douglas was going to be done after the show, with his final match being a job for Justin Credible, but Douglas no-showed the event after problems all week with Heyman. Everything went down the evening before the show as Douglas was at the ECW arena for an independent Breaking the Barrier show put on by Al Isaacs of the Scoops website. Douglas was talking about the financial problems of ECW and claiming that the end of the company was near to people talking with him. He claimed he was trying to get a hold of Heyman all week and that Heyman didn't return any of his calls and that he didn't have a plane ticket to the show issued by Heyman. Heyman's story is that he had a 1-hour conversation with Douglas on May 13th, where they worked out what the scenario would be for the match with Credible, where he'd do the job in 7 minutes, and he said on Friday that everything had been worked out and Douglas would be appearing. Heyman said that since Douglas was in Philadelphia, which was driving distance from Poughkeepsie, New York, that he didn't need a plane ticket to get to Poughkeepsie. That still leaves the unanswered question regarding the ticket back to Pittsburgh from the show, which was never issued. Douglas was telling people that since Heyman didn't even want him at the ECW arena show the previous week and that it would cost him $500 for a plane ticket and he wasn't paying it out of his own pocket with all the money already owed him, that he wasn't going. Douglas was also telling people at the show that the Nashville network had been asking him about the financial stability of the company before doing business with them, and claimed the deal wasn't nearly as much of a done deal as had been hinted within the company. As it turned out, the word got to Heyman about what Douglas was saying regarding the Nashville network. Heyman was really upset. He sent Gabe Sapolsky, an ECW employee, to the ECW arena to set up a conversation to clear things up about the next day, but Douglas waved off Sapolsky, saying to tell Heyman he wasn't there and wouldn't take Heyman's call. At least at press time, there was no deal made between Douglas and WWF, although there are no secrets there have been talks, but no contract has been offered, nor have any money terms even been broached. Nor, despite many rumors to the contrary, is anything close to a done deal made for either Candido or Sytch to join WCW. Candido's match with Taz for the title, originally billed as the main event on the show, was cut to a 1-minute opening squash by Heyman well before the show because he had already decided that he was getting rid of both. Candido and Sytch, like Douglas, are owed a substantial amount of money by ECW. Candido has told people the figure is $80,000, largely for ECW using their credit cards to purchase plane tickets to fly wrestlers in for shows. According to friends of Douglas, his credit card was maxed out due to fronting ECW money when it was in a financial crisis, and he no longer has credit and has to pay for everything in cash. Douglas the next day posted an internet responses to negative pub he was getting for not appearing. His story again was that he attempted to contact ECW several times since he was never issued a plane ticket for an itinerary sheet for the show, and that Heyman had never returned his call. He said the conversation with Heyman where he agreed to put Credible over took place the previous week. He said that he had never been told by anyone in an official capacity that he was no longer with the company, nor had his friend Damian Farron, who handled merchandise, ever been actually told he was fired, and whenever Farron asked if he was fired, was told by Heyman and Steve Carl he was on a 5-week vacation. Douglas, who is said to be contemplating legal action, said that he considered himself still an employee of ECW. Others said that Heyman made it clear, saying to Sapolsky when Douglas wouldn't take Heyman's phone call in front of several people the day before the show, that he was fired and to tell him to have a nice life. Even though Douglas does come off as somewhat like Vince McMahon in that talk show incident with Phil Mushnick, complaining he can't get him to return his calls, and then when he's on the phone refusing to take the call, and after that still complaining afterwards that Heyman didn't return his calls. In his behalf, the company was heavily indebted to him financially. It is believed that his relationship with Heyman soured more as a result of his complaints about being owed money and questioning Heyman's character in the dressing room than directly from his in-ring performance being hampered by frequent injuries. Heyman, since the last pay-per-view, did begin scenarios to face him down and eventually out. He was a large part of the success of the company both as one of its top wrestlers and also as the local promoter in the Pittsburgh area, which has been one of the company's strongest live event markets. As literally a last-minute plan, Heyman called Sid Audi at 11:30 p.m. the night before the show to replace Douglas. The original plan on Saturday night was the backup plan all along in case Douglas didn't appear, that Sabu would wrestle just incredible. While Heyman admitted the scenario on the show where Sid appeared was totally screwed up, largely in execution, he felt he needed to show the people he's trying to do business with that were at the show, in particular TNN, Showtime and MTV, that Douglas' loss on the show wouldn't be missed and that he was replacing him with a bigger star that the fans would pop big for when he showed up, which is what happened. The scenario was a minor disaster for Credible and Lance Storm, who Heyman is building to be the top heels in the company, since Sid sold almost nothing for them and left them looking like too much in the WWF, two talented smaller guys that nobody takes seriously, as opposed to Pat Patterson and Ray Stevens, two talented smaller guys that are thought in many circles to be the greatest tag team in wrestling history and were top headliners around the world, who he was trying to pattern them after. On Friday, when Heyman claimed that Sid faxed him word that he was interested in returning, which should tell you the validity of any rumors that WWF or WCW had expressed any interest in him, and at the time Heyman said he was considering briefly bringing him in for a match with Taz at the end of the show as a surprise where Taz would go over with a choke, but then decided against it to instead do the scenario with Taz he wound up doing. With Douglas out, he made the decision to bring Sid in, for the reasons mentioned above. He said he considered the idea of Sid jobbing for Credible, which for many reasons makes the most sense since it would elevate Credible, who is struggling to be taken seriously at the level Heyman wants him to be, and also at least show the rest of the crew that there isn't the star double standard that in many ways is on the verge of destroying WCW since Sid no-showed a major ECW arena event. And in Sid's defense, ECW had bounced a check on him, although his other complaints about never getting a plane ticket and not even knowing he was booked that weekend weren't true according to people who handle the ticketing. Heyman said he never suggested to Sid doing a job for Credible, claiming it was the fear of a negative audience reaction to Sid losing a 2-minute match and didn't want the people he was trying to do business with hear chance of bullshit or refund. The scenario as it went down, a cheap DQ for a run-in after 2 minutes, considering nearly every major ECW match has run-ins, there are rarely DQs called, left nearly as bad a taste. Heyman said that Sid's appearance was not part of him signing a deal. They never had a contract before, and Heyman claimed he'd never bring Sid back without a contract to protect him from no-shows or refusing to do jobs, but simply a one-time deal, but that they would talk during the week and indicated he may bring Sid to the house show on May 22nd in Detroit to finalize things. There were a lot of other items and talk from around the show. There was no mention on the live broadcast of a return date on pay-per-view, although they were advertising several weeks' worth of house show dates, which, considering the known financial problems and rumors that had swirled around that this would be the last pay-per-view event for the company, was taken as a death knell. As it turned out, a commercial was done for a July 18th event called Heat Wave, which couldn't air until after the main event because the commercial made talked about world champion Taz, the hardcore icon Justin Credible, the Canadian technician Lance Storm and Mr. Pay-Per-View Rob Van Dam as the headliners for the show, as Taz couldn't be called world champion until his match was over. For whatever reason, a production snafu being the reason, The commercial didn't air on viewers' choice for the live show. It did air in satellite dish homes on the live show, and it did air after the replay show both on dish and cable systems. New Jack wasn't there, prompting stories that he had quit the promotion. Heyman didn't want to book him on the show because his trial in the Eric Kulas incident is coming up later this month and there is expected to be at least some national publicity coming from it, and again, Heyman didn't want the people he's trying to do business with tie the two together as a possible deal breaker. Heyman claimed he didn't know of New Jack quitting the company, although there were reports that New Jack was unhappy, claiming the reason he was told his proposed match with Mustafa in a cage was cancelled on the pay-per-view was because he was led to believe that viewers' choice didn't want him on the show when it was actually Heyman who didn't. New Jack has called independent promoters over the past few days looking for work. The show on May 16th, which drew approximately 2,800 to the Mid-Hudson Civic Center in Poughkeepsie, New York, got mixed reviews. The general consensus view seems to be a slight thumbs up, which is about where I'd rate it. The Rob Van Dam vs. Jerry Lynn match, which wound up with both wrestlers being injured and possibly suffering concussions. Van Dam was out momentarily late in the match. Lynn's injury, more obvious because he went limp for a few seconds, came on a spectacular and mistaken headfirst bump off the top rope to the floor, was the show saver and should have been on last because the matches that followed looked weak in comparison. Lynn was hospitalized after the match due to the possible concussion, and he also suffered a broken nose among other injuries that are expected to keep him out of action for a few weeks minimum. He may need surgery to repair his nose, and with the exception of working Chicago to do an angle, may be off as long as until the next pay-per-view show, where at least he's under the impression they are going to do a third match between the two. He was released from the hospital the next morning and is expected to see a neurologist later in the week. The idea of doing a show-long series of angles with the Dudleys to lead to a new main event was an idea to give the people he's trying to do business with the idea that ECW is like Nitro and Raw, which is what everyone's idea of what pro wrestling today should be, with the vignettes leading to impromptu matchups. From a production standpoint, the weak micing of the crowd was fixed as you did get the idea this was a hot audience. On the downside, Joey Styles' audio was too low, particularly as the show wore on. They brought in Cyrus the Virus, Don Callis, as Styles' badly needed sidekick for some of the early matches. But it was annoying how Cyrus disappeared with no mention he was gone, just all of a sudden Styles was doing all the talking. Styles' overreaction to comments by Cyrus about creative control of his gimmick was also annoying, and in the later matches, the problems of Styles doing the show by himself were evident again as he had nobody to bounce off of, which made the announcing seem boring. On the undercard, a match that many thought would be a show stealer with Taka Michinoku vs. Super Crazy was a disappointment as Taka didn't do much. However, Yoshihiro Tajiri vs. Little Guido was better than expected. All in all, it was just another Sunday pay-per-view, no better and no worse than most of the others. There was a major snafu in that the fireball that Balls Mahoney blew at Joel Gertner, which was the setup for the show-long angle, missed badly, but had to be sold anyway, which made the second straight show with a screwed-up fireball spot for ECW. This was made worse because in the post-show highlight package, another angle was shown where it was even more obvious the flame didn't come within 2 feet of Gertner, who sold it anyway. Skull Von Crush, Vito Lograsso pinned Danny During, Daniel Morrison, in the dark match opener. Candido and Sitch, whose looks have changed to the point that instead of being the most marketable woman in the game, she now looks like any indie valet, an average-looking woman all dressed up, came out with Candido saying he was bringing out the Dudleys and they would interfere freely and guarantee him the title win. The fans chanted she's a crack whore, which shows how Sitch's changing harder looks aren't exactly going unnoticed to the average fan. 1. Taz Peter Cernurka beat Candido in 110 to keep the ECW heavyweight title. Taz came out while Candido was doing his interview, ducked a Dudley's attack on the ramp and took them out with a double clothesline. In the ring, he threw 2 suplexes on Candido. Candido came back with a power bomb but missed a headbutt off the top. Taz then put him away with a T-bone suplex in the Kata Jim. After the match, the Dudleys hit Taz with the 3D. Quite a pay-per-view main event. 1/4 star. The Dudleys stuck around doing an interview challenging anyone. Sign guy had a sign that said Devon eats live bait, in reference to Chastity's porno video. There is a very subtle beginnings of a tease where the Dudleys would break up and Devon would go face. Though it talked about running this guy and that guy out and injuring this guy and that girl, no Marlo Thomas jokes here, that's way too dated. He said they split up the Eliminators and now Perry Saturn is wearing a dress. He asked if anyone had the balls to come out, so Mr. Mahoney came out. 2. Bubba Ray, Mark LaMonica, and Devon. Devin Hughes. Dudley beat Spike Dudley, Matthew Hyson, and Balls Mahoney John Reschner, in 7:48 to retain the ECW tag titles. This wasn't any good except a big pop when Bubba powerbombed Spike off the top rope through a table. Mahoney was facing both for about a minute, slipping trying to deliver the Randy Savage elbow off the top, which elicited some chants from the crowd. Mahoney took a bump off the top and Spike did a run-in through the crowd to his music and gave both a low blow, which was real weak. Spike was thrown onto Sign Guy on the floor, but he took an incredible bump over the top. Mahoney's brawling was really bad. They hit a 3D on Spike, but Mahoney made the save with a weak chair shot, which made everyone groan since that's his gimmick. He made up for it by nearly killing every brain cell in D. Von's head with a second shot. Joel Gertner ran in for his patented weak chair shot on Mahoney, but this was terrible even as a spoof. Gertner then tried to throw fire at Mahoney, reprising the classic Hogan Warrior spot from Halloween Havoc from last year. That was hilarious. Unfortunately, Mahoney's fireball didn't come close to Gertner either. It was sold huge, with the ringside officials overreacting to make sure everyone knew not to take it seriously. They hit the 3D on Mahoney for the pin. Fans were booing this match, and with 2 title matches already over, the show was not off to a great start. 1/4 star. 3. Super Crazy Francisco Pantoja Islas pinned Takamichinoku Takao Yoshida in 8:28. Somewhat disappointing due to its potential, but still a good match. Crazy took a tremendous Jerry Estrada-style bump over the top rope. Michinoku went for his springboard plancha, but Crazy missed and he hit the guardrail. Crazy did his special to Crazy, which is actually a reverse footing on the top into a top rope Asai moonsault that Michinoku actually debuted a few years back in Japan. The cameras missed the move the first time, but they broke to a replay about 30 seconds later. Michinoku missed a moonsault by a mile. They did some near falls. Michinoku did his missile dropkick to the back and a Michinoku driver, but sold his knee so couldn't make the pin. Crazy hit 2 power bombs, the first off a Hurricane Rana attempt, for the pin. 2 3/4 stars. They went backstage to Gertner selling the fireball. The Dudleys picked his pocket and found a hit list of guys that Gertner was offering cash, and you know how those ECW guys like cash these days. The first name on the list was Nova, so they went to the dressing room and found him, and beat him up. It's funny, all those guys backstage and Nova was in costume since none had any logical reason for being there. 4. Yoshihiro Tajiri pinned Little Guido James Maritato in 11:06. Tajiri delivered his really stiff kicks. Guido is used to working that style from his UWFI days, which Styles even brought up. They are trying to change his perception from an opening match comedy guy to a solid undercard worker type who can have good matches with the other good smaller workers. Guido missed a pescado. Tajiri did a plancha onto both Guido and Sal E. Graziano, and posted Guido. Tajiri did a really cool sunset flip into a tarantula, which was a tremendous combination spot. Guido took a face-first bump onto the ramp and then delivered a leg drop off the ropes onto a ramp and a Fujiwara armbar off the ropes. Graziano crushed Tajiri with a power slam, but Tajiri kicked out of Guido's pin attempt. Graziano interfered some more. The match ended with Tajiri putting Guido upside down in the corner and dropkicking him hard in the face, and then hitting a brainbuster for the pin. This didn't quite complete the job of elevating Guido from a fan's perception standpoint, but was a step in that direction. 2 3/4 stars. Between matches, the Dudleys beat up Rod Price with a chair and some punches. 5. Lance Storm Lance Evers pinned Tommy Dreamer Tom Laughlin in 13:40. Francine came out with Dreamer. The original plan was during the show to do an angle where Francine and Douglas would split up with Dreamer saving Francine to lead to them being put together as a unit. Instead, they are just together as a unit. Storm had most of the offense and looked really good carrying the match. Dreamer was a step slow on his comebacks. At one point during the match, Dreamer must have messed up his back because he had to be taken to the hospital the next day. They used a lot of weapons, so this was a typical garbage match, but better than usual due to Storm. Storm did almost a rocket launcher type throw of Dreamer off the top onto a chair. Dreamer backdropped Storm over the top through a table. Dreamer juiced from a chair shot and Storm hit him with his belt buckle. Dreamer used a stunner with a chair for a near fall. Dreamer then brought in a ladder. He was shoved off on a bulldog off the apron and laid it on the ladder. Storm hit ref Jim Molyneux with the ladder. Dreamer missed a splash onto the ladder and his knees hit the ladder. Dreamer used a Death Valley driver on Storm off the middle rope through a table for a big pop, and they called it the Spicoli driver, as it's always called in ECW, and mentioned that Tina Spicoli, Louis' sister, was brought in for this show. Cyrus then did a run-in, but Francine speared him and gave him the Bronco Buster. It got big pops when it does make ECW seem minor league when they are using so many of the trademark moves of the major league wrestlers, so to speak, on their own pay-per-view shows. Not saying that everyone in this business doesn't constantly copy everyone else, but when it's done too frequently it makes you look like the copiers as opposed to the innovators. Dreamer gave Dawn Marie the same Beulah panty shot piledriver from a few years back. They did a tease before the match that she wasn't wearing any underwear, but Storm handed her panties and made her put them on while he blocked fans' views. Storm put a garbage can on Dreamer's head and used a spin kick off the top for the pin. Dreamer literally crawled to the back on his knees. 3 stars. The Dudleys beat up Jack Victory, who hasn't been seen in months. Victory is looking huge, like he's got to be in the 350 range. Taz did an interview saying he was going to take out the Dudleys before the end of the show. 6. Rob Van Dam. Rob Sotkowski pinned Jerry Lynn in 26:57 to retain the ECW TV title. People were really into this match from the start, which gave these guys the luxury of doing a slow build that most in ECW don't have. It was a great match, although they were out there too long again as the crowd was dying toward the end, but not as bad as in their previous match. There were more missed spots than you'll ever see in a 4 stars match, most of which went noticed by the crowd, but they always recovered quickly from them and did more tremendous moves than you'll see in 3 great matches. The building of the match was better than in any of Van Dam's previous pay-per-view matches. Van Dam's right eye was busted about 6 minutes in and they teased stopping the match. Lynn used a springboard dropkick on Van Dam on the apron and followed with a plancha onto those pretty blue mats that Styles always makes snide remarks about the other groups for having. Lynn used a bulldog off the middle rope. Fans were booing a weak chair shot. Van Dam sidekicked Lynn to the floor and Lynn took this totally scary headfirst bump that literally could have broken his neck, and acted like he was dead for a split second, as he legit suffered a concussion from the bump. Van Dam whipped him over the guardrail and did a running dive onto him on the other side of the rail. Lynn was cut hard way, taking the bump. He hit the Van Daminator and threw Lynn over the top to give him time to regain his bearings. Van Dam used a corkscrew leg drop off the apron on Lynn, handing on the guardrail. The match was losing momentum at this point. Lynn used a power bomb over the top rope, putting Van Dam through a table, which appears to be the spot. Van Dam may have suffered a slight concussion since he was limp for a few seconds and his eyes were glassy like a boxer who had just been knocked out. Lynn hit Alfonso with a chair and got a great near fall with a German suplex on Van Dam. Both were on the top rope, apparently going to do a belly-to-belly superplex out of the ring through a table, which would have been a 6 spot. But both guys slipped on top, eliciting those memorable missed move chants. Another Van Daminator on Lynn for a good near fall. Van Dam blocked the cradle piledriver and they traded moves until Van Dam hit a split-legged moonsault for a near fall followed by a high frog splash, but Van Dam took too long to cover him and Lynn kicked out. Van Dam then hit another Van Daminator and an even higher frog splash for the pin. 4.25 stars. Big Dick Dudley was back, and he dragged Chris Chetty into the Dudleys' dressing room. Devon punched him and broke his hand, thereby eliminating him from the main event. They beat on Chetty as Taz's cousin, talking about him being blood, but also acknowledging that Taz doesn't care about his cousin, which previous angles have shown, so it's hard to generate much of anything beating on Chetty. Styles, in his first acknowledgement of Douglas not being there, said Douglas wasn't there and probably would never be back in ECW and just said it was a dispute between him and ECW management. Styles never went after Douglas directly. When Sid came out, he definitely favorably compared Sid with Douglas. Credible came out and ran down Douglas, talking about all the beatings he had given him and talked about the millions and millions of his fans, which, with his delivery style so similar to Val Venus and using Rock's language, made him come off as too much of a cheap indie heel. Jeff Jones came out with his robe, and the crowd popped, realizing Sid was back. 7. Sid Audi beat Justin Credible, Peter Polacco, by a DQ in 2:01. This was a disaster. Sid threw Credible over the top with a choke throw and dropped him on the guardrail. Jason Knight hit Sid, but Sid no-showed and powerbombed him. Sid also no-showed all of Credible's offense and choke slammed him. Storm did a springboard double sledge on Sid, which he also didn't sell, which at this point made 0 sense since that was the move they called for the DQ on. It was a series of mix-ups at this point, although Sid was supposed to sell for Storm's run-in. Sabu came out, but the angle hadn't unfolded to where it was supposed to be, so the crowd popped, but was standing there holding a chair watching since Sid was supposed to be selling big before he came in and Sid was barely selling, and even worse, the cameras flashed to him standing there. Fans were chanting for Sabu, so he did the run-in and put Credible and Sid on a table. Storm pulled Credible to safety and Sabu did his double springboard dive, nearly losing his balance on the top ropes, and put Sid through the table. Sabu also put security guy Tony DeVito through a table. Sid got up. He was supposed to be mad at Jones because Jones was ordering the security to take Sabu away, when Sid would have wanted Sabu to stay, but Jones didn't do that spot, so Sid had to power bomb Jones twice for no reason. The crowd went nuts for this, but it made the guys who needed to be converted into top guys looking more like prelim guys than ever. 1 star. 8. Taz beat Bubba Ray Dudley in 12-17 in a Falls Count Anywhere title match. Taz hit Bubba with a weak sign shot and they brawled into the crowd. Taz juiced, apparently blading himself for about the 3rd time in his career. They wound up brawling in the lobby. Taz was really bloody. After Taz delivered a front superplex, Devon came out and hit Taz with a reverse DDT while sign guy distracted ref John Finnegan. Finnegan got bumped and Pee Wee Moore ran in. Bubba used a power bomb for a near fall and the two did a double team back suplex and neckbreaker spot on Taz for a near fall. Taz dropped Devon with a DDT and hit Bubba through a table with a T-bone suplex and used the choke for the tap out to end the show. It was okay. Nobody took Bubba seriously as a challenger for the world title on a pay-per-view show, and this really wasn't the kind of match you'd want to end a big show with. 1 3/4 stars. Steps toward interpromotional matches between All Japan and New Japan to revive a stale Japanese wrestling scene were publicly taken this past week with a much-publicized meeting of All Japan President Mitsuharu Misawa, New Japan President Seiji Sakaguchi and IWGP Heavyweight Champion Keiji Muto, and a second meeting with Misawa and Masahiro Chono. The meetings themselves were at this point publicity stunts more than anything else. Virtually all the magazines were invited to the former meeting, which was taped for broadcast on All Japan's TV show on Nippon TV on May 16. The meeting itself took place a few days earlier and received a ton of newspaper and magazine coverage, and had all three posing in front of a photo of Giant Baba. Nothing in specific was stated about a Tokyo Dome event nor has anything been hinted, but the fact that Muto's face appeared on the All Japan television show tells you negotiations must be pretty deep and things had to have been worked out with the television networks as well. The All Japan and New Japan native wrestlers' contracts include exclusivity as performers for the respective television network, Nippon TV and TV Asahi respectively. There have been 2 periods in history where the groups did interpromotional matches, once in 1979 for a Japanese All-Star card which wasn't televised on either network and brought Baba and Antonio Inoki back as a tag team, and again for several events in 1990. In the first event on the February 10, 1990 Tokyo Dome show, the 2 All Japan vs. New Japan tag team matches which were largely responsible for the first time pro wrestling ever sold out the Dome, Jumbo Tsuruta and Yoshiaki Yatsu vs. Kengo Kimura and Osamu Kido and Genichiro Tenryu and Tiger Mask Misawa vs. Riki Choshu and George Takano, never aired on either group's television show due to those contracts exclusive to the network, although the 2 matches of each group's top foreign star at the time, Stan Hansen vs. Vader, did air on the New Japan program. Muto said that meeting Misawa was like meeting his lover for the first time. It is well known in Japan that Muto has high regard for Misawa, considering Misawa as the only wrestler in Japan who is his true equal, or maybe even his superior. A few years back Muto, at the time he held the IWGP title, had suggested doing a Tokyo Dome match against Misawa and being willing to put Misawa over clean because he thought it would be the right thing for long-term business, but the match never took place for political reasons. That match would have been tons better 3 years ago when Muto wanted to do it because both were 3 years younger, but at the time, business in Japan was so strong nobody needed to do it either. Misawa's public comment was that he wanted to keep All Japan as Baba would have liked it, and it is known that Baba was an isolationist who didn't like doing business with other organizations. Still, it is expected that there will be more talks. There was also a face-to-face dual interview in this week's Japanese version of Playboy magazine with Misawa and Chono. None of the newspapers or wrestling media were even aware that Misawa and Chono had done the interview until the magazine came out. Shinya Hashimoto held a press conference on May 17 announcing that he would be returning to face Genichiro Tenryu on the New Japan June 8 show at Budokan Hall. Hashimoto appeared claiming to weigh 265 pounds, down from the 305 he went into the ring for the Naoya Ogawa match at the Tokyo Dome, and said he wanted to drop a few more pounds before the match. Ticket sales for the June 8 show, which also included the finals of the Best of the Super Junior tournament and a tag match with Muto and Satoshi Kojima vs. Don Frye and Chono, weren't selling well. New Japan had been doing an angle that Hashimoto hadn't signed his contract for this year, which is why he hadn't appeared since the Dome show. Hashimoto never mentioned Ogawa's name. Supposedly New Japan and UFO are on the outs, signing a rematch which would have a ton of interest isn't possible at this time. At the press conference, although talked indirectly about the wrestler he wants to fight and that everyone knows who it is. The World Wrestling Federation's second United Kingdom-only pay-per-view event, called No Mercy, took place on May 16 before a sellout crowd announced on the air as 18,107 at Manchester, England's 9X Arena. It was a pretty straightforward show with no major surprises. Reports generally have considered it an average show, with first-class production but not particularly good wrestling. There were a lot of video features to catch people up on the different major angles pertaining to the corporate ministry, which were the stars of this show. The show, advertised locally on the pay-per-view channels as lasting 3 hours, was over in 2:15, which caused at least some complaints. Most of the show was built around Shane McMahon and the corporate ministry. There was more talk than you'd have expected on Davey Boy Smith, who grew up in Manchester and started his career at the age of 15 in the area back in 1978, and it was the first on-air acknowledgement of his injuries and health problems by either major promotion. Since Smith was given a termination notice by WCW, although at last word WCW was still paying him, he's a free agent and had made it clear he wants to return to the WWF. During the show, Mick Foley did an interview and brought up Smith, saying that he had called him up, but because of the time difference, had woken him up, and later in the show they aired a video tribute to Smith showing clips of his legendary Wembley Stadium match where he won the IC title from Bret Hart in 1992 with Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler, who did the show talking about his health problems. Smith's condition was well known in England because of exaggerated front-page type stories in News of the World, the most well-read tabloid. Thanks to Brett Burks for the rundown and match ratings for the show. The show opened, like a Raw, with a corporate ministry interview with Shane McMahon telling what he was going to do during the show. The interview was said to have not been very good as McMahon botched some lines. The basic was that the main event would be turned into a no-holds-barred match. 1. Tiger Ali Singh, Joe Dinker Singh Hans Jr., pinned Gillberg, Dwayne Gill, in 1:05 after a neckbreaker. Before the match, Ross announced the match as Singh vs. Goldberg by accident. When Gillberg came out, Ross said something to the effect of Gillberg, Goldberg, there isn't much difference. Crowd wasn't into it except popped when Gillberg hit the spear, which Singh sold. As Gillberg was playing to the crowd, Singh got up and hit the neckbreaker for the pin. Dud. 2. Farouk, Ron Simmons, and Bradshaw, John Layfield, and Viscera, Nelson Frazier Jr., beat Gangrel, David Heath, and Edge, Adam Copeland, and Christian J. Resso in 13:49. Edge and Christian looked real good carrying the match, which was better than expected, and the Brood overall got a good crowd reaction. The finish saw Mideon do give Gangrel a DDT on the floor and throw him into the ring where Bradshaw pinned him with his clothesline. 1 3/4 stars. 3. Steve Blackman beat Darren Drozdov in 7:53 with a Fujiwara armbar. Blackman was no different from when he was last seen. The plan, at least as of a few weeks ago, was for him to return as a heel, and that probably is still the case, but since it hasn't happened on television, it hasn't happened. Not much heat. 1/2 star. Foley came out for an interview and first congratulated the Manchester United team for winning the Premier League Championship, which took place earlier that day. That actually got something of a mixed reaction live. Manchester's home team is considered the most famous professional sports franchise in the world. Soccer is, after all, by far the most popular sport with the most worldwide following, and I read somewhere that the Manchester team is valued at $1 billion. But there were a lot of fans in the building from around the country, many of whom favored the rival Tottenham team that was beaten in the game. He then talked about Smith. 4. Kane, Glenn Jacobs beat Mideon Dennis Knight via DQ in 4:36 when the entire corporate ministry did a run-in after Kane had delivered a choke slam. X-Pac made the save with a kendo stick. 1/4 star. 5. Nicole Bass Fuchs pinned Terry Pac in 27 seconds after a choke slam. This was scheduled as Sable vs. Tori, and Sable was there and came out and did the grind and then said she had a cold and couldn't wrestle and would have Bass take her place. Bass no-sold a few blows and hit the choke slam right away. Said to be beyond awful. Dud. 6. Shane McMahon pinned X-Pac, Sean Waltman, in 8:21 to retain the European title. I know what you're saying. Did McMahon retire the title on television and it has never been referred to again? The answer is yes, but for this show only. That interview never took place. This was said to have been a decent match, but not close to their WrestleMania match. McMahon tried to run away early, but Pat Patterson and Gerald Briscoe caught him running away and threw him back in the ring. Hunter Hearst Helmsley and Chyna were at ringside. The finish saw Triple H and Chyna interfere on 4 occasions, with Chyna tripping the ref and Triple H using the pedigree on X-Pac and putting McMahon on him for the pin. 2 stars. Before the next match, Mankind was attacked by the entire corporate ministry and they injured his bad knee. 7. Billy Gunn, Monty Saw, pinned Mankind, Michael Foley, in 11:27. This match consisted largely of Gunn working over the injured knee before winning with a famouser on a chair. It was described as going too long with just working the knee. 1.5 stars. At this point in the show, Ross and Lawler did the tribute for Smith. 8. Steve Austin, Steve Williams, retained the WWF title in a 3-way over Undertaker, Mark Calloway, and Hunter Hearst Helmsley, Paul Levesque, in 15:07. All 3 brawled outside the ring for 5 minutes. Technically, similar to the ECW pay-per-view show, the bell never actually rang to ever start the match. At the beginning, Undertaker and Helmsley worked as a team on Austin, but as the match wore on, it became everyone for themselves telling the story that both wanted the title for themselves, and there could only be one winner. Austin ended up hitting the stunner on both, but before he could score a pin, the entire corporate ministry ran in. At this point, all the faces on the undercard ran in. They brawled to where the original wrestlers were left in the ring, and Austin hit a stunner on Chyna and another on Helmsley for the pin. He also, after the match, delivered a stunner to McMahon and another to Helmsley, and the show ended with Austin, X-Pac and Earl Hebner in the ring drinking beer together. 3 stars. We don't have the complete ratings rundown due to some mechanical problems at our end, but the results for May 17th were pretty well as expected and as they are going to be for quite a while. Raw finished with a 6.34 rating, 5.62 first hour and a record-setting competitive 7.06 seconds hour, and 9.4 share, while Nitro did a 3.36 rating, 3.94 first hour, 3.54 seconds hour, 2.60 third hour, and 5.0 share, which comes 0.01 of tying largest margin of victory for Raw ever set 2 weeks ago. The head-to-head 2 hours plus saw Nitro average a 3.07, its lowest in years. Raw broke the all-time Monday night ratings for a competitive hour during the second hour, and tied the all-time record for a competitive quarter, as opposed to an overrun, with a 7.3 for the Rock vs. Undertaker casket match. The final quarter hour, with Raw having the beginning of Austin vs. Triple H, did a 7.2, while Nitro did a 2.5 for the ending of the Raven and Saturn vs. Benoit and Malenko and beginning of Nash vs. Page matches. In the overrun, with the finish of Austin vs. Triple H and Nash vs. Page going head-up, it was a 7.8 for Raw and a 2.4 for Nitro. There is no such thing as competitive, although Nitro only lost by a 5.0 to 4.2 margin in the first head-to-head quarter, where Nitro had the Flair and Charles Robinson vs. Savage and Medusa match going against Raw's X-Pac and Road Dogg and Kane vs. Billy Gunn and Brown and Henry 6-man. Even the next quarter, with Jarrett and Blazer vs. Godfather and Venus going against the Long Piper interview with the angle that included Bischoff, Savage and Nash, was a 5.2 to 3.7 before the bottom fell out, as Raw did a 6.2 for Meat vs. Test and Nitro fell to a 2.9 for a rundown of Slamboree and the beginning of Hawk vs. Fit Finlay. From that point on, it got ugly, with WCW getting a slight increase to a 3.2 for the Rick Steiner vs. Sting match, even though Raw did a 6.3 for an Austin confrontation with the corporate ministry. Raw had an amazing 4.7 ratings points edge over the first 30 minutes of the second hour, doing 7.3 and 7.1 for Rock vs. Taker, followed by the Brood vs. Hardy Boys and Michael Hayes, while Nitro did 2.6 and 2.4 for the 13 minutes long Hennig vs. Conan match. Bottom line, as we write every week, it is suicide to have matches that long unless they involve the top names in a head-to-head segment. Other ratings for the week saw Heat to a 4.1, Live Wire at 1.8, Superstars at 2.2, WCW Saturday Night a 1.9, and Thunder was preempted due to the NBA playoffs. Japanese television rundown. May 2nd, All Japan. The show consisted of just the Baba retirement ceremony and the Misawa Vader match from the Tokyo Dome. The ceremony had Lord Blears come out as the ceremonial witness, as he had done in so many of the big matches in All Japan history, the Destroyer as Baba's partner as he had done so many times in the 70s, and Gene Kiniski and Bruno Sammartino as opponents. They showed a portrait of Baba on the video screen at the Dome and had everyone say a sentence or two about Baba. It was really nice. I don't think something like this could ever happen in the US, and certainly not on this magnitude.
Motoko Baba then put Baba's boots in the ring and they had a 10 count while talking about Baba's career and triumphs with Baba on the big screen.
All the wrestlers were watching from ringside and a lot of people were really sad.
Even though Motoko is probably the most feared person in Japanese wrestling, it was unusually touching to see her after this was over, crying heavily, sitting next to Baba's boots, and then grabbing the boots and putting them right next to her. 1.
Misawa won the Triple Crown from Vader in 1807.
This was a really good match as you'd expect, more than acceptable as the main event on the biggest show in the history of the company, but this won't go down as an all-time legendary match as it had the potential of being because of the stage it was playing on before 65,000 fans. Both guys are not what they once were due to age and injuries, but they still know enough and have enough left to put on as good a main event as would be seen anywhere on a regular basis in the world. But you can also see the slowness and stiffness of movement between spots, which hurts the almost flawless psychology of building a match that Misawa has. Vader was killing Misawa early with the forearms in the corner and short punches, followed by a power bomb outside the ring. Misawa made his comeback including his elbow suicida and a pescado splash from the ring to the floor, followed by a missile dropkick and a German suplex. Vader ducked a move and hit a German suplex and went for a power bomb, but Misawa shifted his weight and landed on his feet. That move didn't look quite right. Vader came back with a German suplex onto Misawa's head and a splash, followed by a tiger driver for a near fall. Vader missed a moonsault and Misawa came back with a superplex and a frog splash for near falls, followed by a DDT wall off the ropes, which didn't look that great. His spinning elbow smash. Vader came back with a sit splash and power bomb for a near fall before Misawa hit more elbows for the finish. 3 3/4 stars.
Mexico.
The return to Arena Mexico on May 21 will feature Great Sasuke defending the NWA middleweight title against Ultimo Guerrero, who won an elimination match on the May 14 Arena Coliseo show. There were also challenges at the end of the show going back and forth between Negro Casas and Scorpio Jr. over a hair versus hair match, although at the show it wasn't made specific if the match would take place this week. The May 14 and May 11 shows at Arena Coliseo were both sellouts, and there were approximately 250 fans that came in for the former show on a Japanese tour plus a lot of Japanese media since Sasuke is in. It was advertised in Mexico that the May 14 card was going to be taped for Japanese television. It wasn't made clear what station, but the best assumption would be Guerra since Sasuke was on the show, and all the Mexican wrestlers had major working shoes on knowing so many people would watch them and a lure of lucrative Japanese tours if they impressed the right people. The big match in the middle was set with Tarzan Boy and Zorro and Pantera and Tony Rivera and Olympico versus Fuerza Guerrera and Violencia and Ultimo Guerrero and Black Warrior and Rey Bucanero.
The local press reported this match as being the best match of the year at EMLL, although those who have seen the match weren't going that overboard in the praise. The match should air this coming weekend on Galavision, although I have no idea when that show airs because whenever I try to see it, soccer is on.
It wound up with all the Technicos eliminated but both Guerrero and Bucanero left on the Rudo side, so they had to face each other in a singles match.
Guerrero scored the pin with a backwards superplex, literally dropping Bucanero on his head with a scary-looking move for the pin. Sasuke teamed with Negro Casas and Atlantis in the main event, beating Zumbido and Apollo Dantes and Scorpio Jr. in straight falls with the Rudos DQ'd in fall 2.
Both EMNLL and AAA are trying to convince Pero Aguayo to continue wrestling until September. Aguayo had said that the June 11th Triple Mania show would be his final match with AAA, and then he'd have one final retirement match for EMLL at Arena Mexico.
The Aguayo retirement tour has been packing houses throughout Mexico. EMLL wants his retirement on its own 66th anniversary show, which at this point is scheduled for September 17th. Atlantis beat Dr. Wagner Jr. on May 10th in Puebla to win the CMLL World Light Heavyweight title. AAA and Antonio Pena are again making noises about running shows in the United States this year. All Japan.
Even though the question of presidency of the company has been answered, there is still something of a power struggle with Motoko Baba and Mitsuharu Misawa.
No matter how it's portrayed, it is still Baba who is funding the company and has to give approval to any decisions that involve major finances. The general feeling is the Tokyo Dome show itself was a great event because of the farewell to Baba, but that it didn't come off as the major league production that the big K1 and New Japan shows do when they run the Dome.
Because Giant Baba was who he was and what he represented, which was old-style black boots and black trunks, hard, long wrestling matches. As long as he was around, that was considered okay.
After the Dome show, there were a lot of comments how, compared with New Japan and K1, This wasn't a major league show aura. In the listing of officers in The Observer, Sachiko Baba is a cousin of Shohei Baba who has always worked in the office. It's expected that the Road Warriors will come in for the July tour. They want to work 12 weeks per year, with the idea being 6 tours but only 2 weeks of the tour. Misawa's ideas were for them to work 4 tours, but the entire tour, so deals aren't finalized, although both seem to want to do business. With Baba off the house shows, it is more important for drawing in smaller cities to have legendary names in Japan like the Road Warriors and Vader appearing on the show since Baba is no longer there. Johnny Ace, who books a lot of foreign talent, has also brought up the possibility of using Mike Alfonso, the Gladiator / Mike Awesome, and possibly Carl Ouellet, but neither has been approved by Misawa. Alfonso has been out of action for months due to having reconstructive knee surgery. He was a regular for FMW, but appeared to be ready to make the move to quit that office and become a regular with ECW. With ECW's current situation combined with the idea that FMW, which is drawing poorly and Alfonso's pay is $2,000 per week, combined with Alfonso himself realizing it's time to make the move to the more stable larger office, he's expressed interest in coming in under the name Mike Awesome as a full-time foreigner. This has also raised questions about the status of Gary Albright, who is not on the next tour and whose stock has dropped because he hasn't had good matches, and his original shooter reputation from his famous series of matches with Nobuhiko Takada in UWFI has faded after years of doing traditional pro wrestling. Officially, All Japan is just saying Albright will be taking 1 tour off. A Jun Akiyama vs Masahito Kakihara singles match has been added to the June 4th show in Sapporo. April 25th TV did a 2.6 rating and the May 2nd show, which was the Dome show, did a 4.8. New Japan. Kazuo Yamazaki will be out of action for approximately 6 months due to what is either a lung infection or possibly a collapsed lung along with a bronchitis. Yamazaki, 35, had bled from the mouth after matches several times on the last tour. The belief is that he may have suffered a hard kick which led to some internal damage. As someone mentioned to me this past week, in Japan, when somebody goes down, the reason is usually they were injured, often by a stiff kick. In the US, it's generally because they were banged up and took so many drugs to keep going that the drugs do them in. May 22nd in Soka they are having a Super Juniors 8-man match with Shocker and Dr. Wagner Jr. and Jushin Liger and El Samurai vs Minoru Tanaka and Masaaki Mochizuki and Shinjiro Otani and Koji Kanemoto. Kanemoto, who is expected to work this tour as defending Super Junior Tournament champion, has been bothered by his chronically bad knees, which is why his May 3rd title defense against Tatsuhito Takaiwa was kept shorter than is traditional for IWGP Junior title matches. Atsushi Onita ran his own show on May 13th at Korakuen Hall and said that he wouldn't be wrestling in New Japan anymore. That's almost certainly an angle because on May 14th, Chono said that he wanted to meet with Onita, so it just appears they are going to also set up Chono and Onita as a tag team. There are still attempts at backdoor business with WWF. The holdup is that New Japan has so many chiefs that making a big money move takes time. There are those in power that don't like dealing with American companies and those who have ties to WCW and people like Scott Norton and NWO Sting who are popular with the group that WCW would pull from them if a WWF deal was made. Although All Japan has used WWF talent like Bart Gunn and the Road Warriors, and the deal to use Steve Williams on the Dome show was originally a WWF deal, the money figures WWF wants are way more than All Japan is willing to pay. Kensuke Sasaki vs. Meng was also added to the June 8th Budokan Hall show. May 31st in Osaka complete show is Samurai and Kashin and Hamada and Wagner Jr. vs. Shocker and Orihara and Mochizuki and Takaiwa, Masakazu Fukuda vs. Tadao Yasuda, Michiyoshi Ohara and Tatsutoshi Goto vs. Takashi Iizuka and Shiro Koshinaka, Atani vs. Tanaka, Liger vs. Kanemoto, Kazuyuki Fujita and Yuji Nagata vs. Brian Johnston and Sasaki, Meng and Tatsumi Fujinami vs. Manabu Nakanishi and Tenryu and Chono and Don Fry and NWO Sting vs. Kojima and Tenzan and Muto. May 8th TV show did a 3.3 rating. Other Japan notes. Koto Fuyuki held a press conference on May 18th with Mr. Ganasuke and Yukihiro Kanemura and announced that FMW would change its name to WU, for World Entertainment Wrestling. Fuyuki said he'd be the commissioner. Fuyuki is the most Americanized of all the Japanese bookers and even hinted at the press conference that he thought WWF style was the way to go and that All Japan and New Japan style was too old-fashioned. This may be at least partially an angle because Atsushi Onita wants to do a 10-year anniversary of the beginning of FMW show, and by changing the name and not having an FMW, it may be an excuse for an angle to explain Onita coming back. Fuyuki said he'd be firing some of the guys before the Korakuen Hall show on May 31st, which also sounds like an angle. He said they'd be creating new Wu heavyweight tag team and six-man belts and that a tournament would be held in July to determine the six-man champions. He said there wouldn't be a junior heavyweight title because Yuki Sato holds the FMW junior heavyweight belt and his shoot style is diametrically opposed to Total Entertainment style. He said all matches would be changed to falls count anywhere and there would be no count outs, and also said that low blows would be automatic DQs, probably borrowed from the Mexican psychology. Also on the same day, All Japan Women announced big shows on July 10th and July 11th outdoors at the Fuji TV Network studios as television tapings. The first night would be headlined by the Zaps vs. Mima Shimoda and Itsuko Mita over the WWWA tag titles, and the second night would have Yumiko Hata defending the WWWA title against Kyoko Inoue. Big Japan announced its May 30th Kawasaki show headlined by Shadow WX defending the deathmatch title against Ryuji Yamakawa in a no-rope barbed wire ring surrounded by fire match that would have a big truck with a casket at ringside and the casket would be filled with weapons. It was a very slow news week as the biggest cards were Korakuen Hall events. Gia ran May 16th and drew an overflow crowd announced at 2,200 which saw Asia Kong win the AW title from Chigusa Nagio in 10:54 after 8 spinning backfist punches in a match where Nagio vowed to retire if she lost, although the latter deal is a total gimmick as Nagio wants to start from scratch as a way to get fans behind her new story. Ouch. If you've ever seen Kong deliver one, you know it's no picnic to take. The big deal was that Kong worked the match total face style, not using any gimmicks. I believe this sets up a rematch between the two which may be taking place sometime in the next week or two, where if Nagio loses again, she has to retire. Atsushi Onita also sold out the building on May 13th, announced at 2,150, for something of an old-style FMW nostalgia show where they brought back the old no-rope barbed wire street fight tornado deathmatch main event that made FMW famous years back, with Onita and Shigeo Okamura and Samba Asako, a former FMW wrestler who retired years ago, beating Tenryu and Shoji Nakamaki and Ichiro Yaguchi. In return for Tenryu working this show, Onita agreed to work Tenryu's War 7th anniversary show on June 20th at Korakuen Hall in a singles match as Tenryu will work twice, against Onita and also in a tag with Magnum Tokyo against Judo Suwa and a mystery partner. Also on Onita's show they brought back Crusher Maidamari and Shark Tsuchiya to work a women's street fight match using a barbed wire baseball bat, brought back Pandita, who was an early FMW gimmick, and also brought back the old FMW tag team of Dr. Luther and Dr. Hannibal, Len St. Clair and Steve Gillespie from Western Canada Weekly Pro Wrestling for its 900th issue did a readers' poll and the results stunned everyone. 50% of the readers of the magazine had been wrestling fans for 3 years or less. There's a certain amount of assumed knowledge of famous matches and scenarios written with the idea people remember wrestling on primetime television, and the fact is half the readers weren't even around for the Muto Takada matches. In the US, the rapid turnover of wrestling fans because of its fad nature is expected. In Japan they are considered more like NFL fans with a longer turnaround frame. CMLL Japan will be running a tour from August 8th to August 15th with Mil Mascaras, Solar, Mr. Niebla, Oriental, Tsubasa, Max Bunny, which sounds like Max Mini in WWF since he used to be Baby Rabbit, Ultimo Guerrero, Archangel, Grand Marcus Jr., Sumbito, Dr. O'Borman Jr., Grand Sheik, Super Cacao, Super Delphin, Dick Togo, and Masato Yakashiji. Mascaras, who turns 61 this summer but has aged a lot better than most, came to Japan on May 4th at Delphin Osaka Pro Wrestling Show to greet the fans and talk about returning on that tour. This week's Weekly Gong had a 2-page spread on major shoot matches that are expected to take place over the next few months, listing Kiyoshi Tamura vs. Yoshihisa Yamamoto in rings, Yuki Kondo vs. Kiyuma Kunyoku in Pancrase, and an interesting Gilbert Evel vs. Semischult match on a rings free fight gala, which have been all shoot show in Amsterdam, Holland on June 20th, which is a rare rings vs. Pancrase match on foreign soil. Both are great strikers, although it's hard to beat Schult's height advantage being 6'11". Evel is a really wild, entertaining fighter who opened a lot of eyes beating Tsuyoshi Kosaka on April 23rd in Osaka. There will be a Masami Soranaka memorial show on June 9th at Korakuen Hall. Soranaka was one of the original bookers of the UWF promotion when it was really hot and was the son-in-law of Karl Gotch, who died 7 years ago of cancer. It'll mainly be Battle Arts wrestlers appearing plus Satoru Sayama. Speaking of Battle Arts, its May 14th show at Sapporo Nakajima Sports Center drew only about 1,000 fans for the Mitsuhiro Matsunaga vs. Yuki Ishikawa Bed of Nails deathmatch main event. Ishikawa, a big Antonio Inoki fan,
who actually patterns his big shows around symbolism from his own childhood watching New Japan in the late 70s. His Sumo Hall show was headlined by himself, using moves Inoki used, beating Inoki's old rival Bob Backlund, using old-style Backlund moves plus bringing back the Road Warriors,
which actually was a successful event.
This show was based around a bed of nails match with Inoki vs. Umanosuke Ueda at Budokan Hall on February 8, 1978, where neither wrestler took the bump into the bed of nails. In later years, other promotions have done that gimmick and wrestlers like Matsunaga have taken the bump.
But the finish was Inoki breaking Ueda's arm in storyline with an arm bar, and he was out of action for a long time, so fans got storyline destruction, so they were happy at the time that something extra was delivered.
The finish was a throwing in the towel, so in this match, Matsunaga used all kinds of gimmicks including a fireball before Alexander Otsuka threw in the towel for Ishikawa. Daisuke Ikeda beat Backlund when the ref stopped the match as Backlund suffered an apparent broken nose. Otsuka and Muhammad Yone beat Hayabusa and Tetsuhiro Kuroda in 21-13 while Yuhi Sano of Takada's team captured the FMW Junior title from Minoru Tanaka.
Sano, who had spent the last several years doing shoot style with UWFI and Kingdom, and then actual shoots with Pride and Pancrase, where he'd taken savage beatings as that just wasn't his thing, did pro wrestling moves like topaz, power bombs and using a dragon suplex to win the match. After the match, Sano talked about wanting to put his title up against Jushin Liger, since Liger vs. Sano matches from 1990 are now legendary. The other gimmick was Masao Orihara and Takeshi Ono coming out with Strong Machine masks. They originally were trying to get Ikamasa Wakamatsu, the former manager of the Strong Machines in New Japan, and who is now running for public office, was too busy campaigning and couldn't do the show. Orihara and Ono came out wearing the masks, then took them off and wrestled under their own names.
Ray Bucanero and Chris Chetty worked the next Michinoku tour from June 12 to June 27 along with Shima Nobunaga, Sumo Fuji, and Judo Suwa. Ultimo Dragon is doing a deal where they rotate his wrestlers for each Michinoku tour.
IWA on May 16 in Yamato headlined by Ghostface, Tarzan Goto, keeping the IWA title beating Mr. Pogo.
Maiko Matsumoto of Gia officially retired on May 15.
She hasn't wrestled in months after suffering severe back damage. Here and there. In one of those good practical jokes, Mike Moraldo, who wrestles as Ace Darling, was told that he was going to be part of an interpromotional angle and do a run-in on Gino Caruso's show on May 12 with Devon Storm. When he did the run-in, there were only 25 to 30 fans in the building, and as he looked closer, they were all pro wrestling people including Jim Cornette, King Kong Bundy, Steve Corino, Nova and promoter Jim Kettner, and it turned out to be a surprise bachelor party as he's getting married shortly.
The Breaking the Barrier show at the ECW Arena on May 15, promoted by Al Isaacs of Scoops, drew approximately 400 fans and about 300 paid for matches featuring a lot of indie talent, including the Pitbulls, Abdullah the Butcher, Manny Fernandez, Rick Link, Stevie Richards,
Tom Brandy, Ed Banger Mosh, and others. Shane Douglas did one of those New Line work shoot interviews about not appearing on the ECW pay-per-view the next night. We heard a lot of wrestlers did some insane moves and heard good reports on the three-way with the wrestlers from Steel City Wrestling, Mike Quackenbush, Don Montoya, and Lou Marconi. The WNBC TV news segment on pro wrestling that will air on May 23 after the Jesse Ventura movie will only air on that station. I'm not sure of the deals made regarding interviews with WWF talent, but Jay Andronako of the WWF was able to stop other NBC affiliates from potentially airing the piece. Phil Mushnick wrote scathing columns in both the New York Post and TV Guide regarding the FX network's decision to starting this fall season air Tough Man matches as a weekly Friday night prime-time show to attempt to reach the young male audience that has been so successful for pro wrestling. Longtime St. Louis wrestling fan and independent wrestling commissioner Harry White, who is one of the few who dates back to when St. Louis really was the wrestling capital of North America, who just moved to Austin, Texas, was given a goodbye present from WCW promoter Gary Juster of front row tickets to the recent Slamboree. There was some local radio and newspaper coverage to the commissioner retiring. Anyway, he wants to get a hold of wrestling fans in Austin, Texas to watch the pay-per-view shows with, so you can contact him at 512-459-0416. Inside Edition will be doing a piece on May 21 on a combination of people who want to be wrestlers and what they go through, which includes the Eric Cula's ECW tape if you've never seen what all the controversy is about. Vince McMahon was also interviewed for the piece. Paul Heyman and New Jack were asked to be interviewed but wouldn't comment due to the trial beginning next week. Stephen Dunn and Reno Riggins have forfeited the NWA North American Tag Team titles. The June 5th Music City show will be the second annual Tojo Yamamoto Memorial Show with a main event of Jerry Lawler and Bill Dundee versus Colorado Kid and Jackie Fargo. Geez, he's got to be 66 years old by now. The movie based on the Tiger Mask wrestling character, as opposed to the Japanese animated cartoon that predated the wrestling character, played by Satoru Sayama in the early 80s, called Lone Tiger, will be released to video on July 27th. The New York Times on May 17th did a front-page story on wrestlers running for office, focusing on Bob Backlund's bid for the U.S. House of Representatives. Backlund, who is campaigning with a red bow tie and red clip-on suspenders that the paper said makes him look like a stray member of a barbershop quartet, was profiled along with Jerry Lawler talking about running for mayor of Memphis and former 70s Pittsburgh wrestler Johnny DeFazio, who is running for the Allegheny County Council. They also mentioned Davie, Florida Mayor Harry Venus. But he's actually a politician who has done a few pro wrestling matches as a gimmick as opposed to an actual wrestler trying to use his ring fame to get elected. Backlund himself admitted never voting in an election until voting for Dole for president in 1996. Backlund is expected to win the Republican nomination in an election that the Democrats have dominated for decades. The story said Backlund has retired from wrestling in the United States, although we see his name in the results, usually around New Jersey for Dennis Corraluzzo, all the time, but still wrestles in Japan. He is also printing t-shirts calling himself the Wrestling Republican. Lawler said that political races in general have become either beauty contests or popularity contests. When you're talking about wrestling, you're talking about people who have made a living in front of crowds and on TV. Backlund in his interview claimed that pro wrestling wasn't staged, which should win him credibility points, but then said that the quotes in pro wrestling magazines aren't real quotes. On the May 15th Memphis show, it opened with Vic Grimes in a parking lot telling downtown Bruno to run him over with a car. A few years back, Grimes did an angle in Hayward, California where a car door going fairly fast hit him in a parking lot. Anyway, Bruno went to do it but everyone stopped him and Grimes yelled at everyone for stopping him. Grimes promised before the show was over people would see nothing they had ever seen before on Memphis television. They set up a feud with J.R. Smooth, Fatu, and Glenn Kulka against the Freebirds. There were several players from the Memphis Redbirds at the studio and Grimes asked the biggest one to hit him with a chair and they did. Then Grimes wanted to hit the guy back but Dave Brown and Corey Macklin along with ref Aubrey Wayne stopped him. Derek King came out with a personal head of security, his own Ralphus, but instead of being a fat guy, it was an old sickly guy called C.B. Wyatt. Nicole Bass did an interview saying she would get rid of King because Brandon Baxter got her started in wrestling. Nice fiction. They did another angle where Mike Tierney tried to get at retired wrestler Buddy Wayne but Kurt Angle cut him off. Grimes brought out a wheelbarrow full of weapons and challenged anyone in the back. Rocky the Redbird, the team mascot, started taunting Grimes and Grimes beat him up until the PPW staff and several of the baseball players pulled him off. At the May 28th Redbird Rampage show, Mark Henry, Meat and Prince Albert from the WWF would be there along with Michael Hayes and Terry Gordy as a tag team against Smooth and Kulka. Henry vs. Albert is one of the matches announced. Brandon Baxter did an interview with bandages on his eye saying he probably would never regain sight in the eye and said it was real life, at least he didn't say it was a shoot like in ECW angles, and that King had done it to him. He said he was going back to Texas and was crying and hugged everyone doing an interview patterned after that famous interview Shawn Michaels did to get himself out of the 1997 WrestleMania and dropping the title to Sid. King and Wyatt then came out and put a plastic bag over his head. Brown and Macklin both got physically involved. Brown has virtually never gotten physically involved in 3 decades announcing the show, but then again King is half Brown's size. Carl Pierre Willett is headed in under the name Chris the Dragon Cannonball, blowing fire out of his mouth a la Ricky Steamboat's WWF gimmick. Considering this was likely a WWF gimmick set to try out and that Steamboat owned the Dragon name for wrestling in the US, remember him filing a suit against Yoshihiro Asai for using the ring name Ultimo Dragon? I can smell a problem. Kid Wicked did an interview saying he was a franchise player and would show Tierney, who is 3 times his size, who he called a big robot, how to work. Tierney ended up DQ'd for throwing down the ref. Bradley vs. Grimes had a weapons match and Grimes' big spot was jumping off the top of the television van onto Bradley on a table with a somersault senton. The table didn't break, and Grimes rolled off and hit the concrete pavement with a sick thud. The show ended with the match still in progress. Carlos Colon's knee surgery took place on May 4th for damage to his right knee. The damage wasn't as severe as thought and he's expected back in about 2 months. They brought in a new babyface called King Alexander, said to be from Macedonia, and Mark Maverick. The female wrestler in called Sweet Destiny has wrestled in the US as Brandy Alexander. Mark Youngblood didn't come in to reform his tag team, but Chris did. Victor Quiñones will be running an IWA show on June 25th in Puerto Rico with Undertaker vs. Big Show, Kane vs. Bossman, Road Dogg vs. Billy Gunn, Val Venus vs. Draws, Edge and Gangrel vs. Miguel Perez and Bob Holly, Huracan Castillo vs. Midian, and Jeff Jarrett vs. Taka Michinoku.
They are also doing TV May 19th to May 21st in Carolina, Puerto Rico with Los Boricuas, Jeff Hardy, Taka Michinoku, Gangrel and El Hijo del Santo as the headliners for a TV show that will be called Zona Caliente. Hot Zone Naoya Ogawa's second match in for Dennis Corluzzo on June 5th at St. John Vianney High School in Holmdel, New Jersey is being advertised against Don Fry, which would actually be a huge deal in Japan since Fry is with New Japan and Ogawa with UFO, although the two feuded all of last year with New Japan. At last word, Fry wasn't a definite due to Japanese politics, and there is a possibility that former UFC fighter Dave Beneteau would be the opponent. Blaine DeSantis of Pennsylvania Championship Wrestling brought in several indie wrestlers from around North America as well for shows on May 14th in Hamburg, Pennsylvania and May 15th in Wind Gap, Pennsylvania. The former drew about 800 fans. Apparently Venom Black from Tijuana really impressed, with the highlight being a three-way with Christopher Daniels and Reckless Youth. Also brought in for the weekend were Tony Jones and Michael Modest of All Pro Wrestling, 2 Cold Scorpio, who won the PCW title in a three-way over Daniels and Youth on May 14th, but dropped it the next night to Lance Diamond, and Detroit/Ontario guys Joe E. Legend and Zach Wilde. Bad news: Allen didn't have the knee replacement surgery after all after he was in pre-op and his blood pressure was too high, so surgery had to be postponed. The Los Angeles Times on May 15th ran a front-page story on independent wrestling with interviews with local independent wrestlers. The story, which included a sidebar about Billy Anderson and Jesse Hernandez School of Hard Knocks in San Bernardino, was pretty accurate about the scene, talking about people's hopes and dreams and working for little pay. All-Star Championship Wrestling on May 28th in Green Bay, Wisconsin at Stadium View Sports Bar. If you bring an observer to the door, you can get $2 off any ticket. RF Video at P.O. Box 797, Langhorne, Pennsylvania 19047 has a 2-tape 8-hour shoot interview with Vader with clips about his career around the world for $35. MMA. Tentative plans with nothing signed for the July 16th UFC pay-per-view from Cedar Rapids, Iowa are Maurice Smith vs. Marco Ruiz, Pat Miletic vs. Andre Pederneiras for the UFC lightweight title, Ron Waterman vs. Andre Roberts, the 350-pound Indian who went down to Gary Goodridge in less than 1 minute, and Jeremy Horn vs. Kenji Kawaguchi from Shudo, who has a 14-5-4 record over there. Why UFC, if they can get someone from Shudo, is using him instead of people like Hayato Sakurai or Jutaro Nakao, who beat Miletic clean via tap out in Hawaii, is bringing in Kawaguchi from Japan at all that expense is hard to understand. But this entire show is hard to understand. The most important aspect of this show is more to have a clean show with good technical fights and not much controversy, since this is most likely the show that the Nevada State Athletic Commission is going to attend and base its ruling, which Semaphore Entertainment Group is banking on for its survival, on. No matches have been announced for the Pride 6 show on July 4th at Yokohama Arena, but announced as fighting are Nobuhiko Takada, Kazushi Sakuraba, Inson Inoue, Akira Shoji, Mark Kerr, Gary Goodridge, Igor Vachenchin, Vitor Belfort, Marco Ruiz, and Naoya Ogawa. K1 is running 3 major events next month. June 5th in Zurich, Switzerland has Andy Hug vs. Stefan Liko for Hug's WKA Muay Thai World title and Mike Bernardo vs. Andrew Thompson. June 6th in Sapporo is basically a B-quality show with Peter Aerts vs. Maurice Smith, Jim Mullen, who did UFC a few years back and looked really out of shape in his K1 debut earlier this year against Aerts, versus Masaki Sadake, Duncan James, who I just saw fight over the weekend in San Jose and he got hammered by Jerome Turkin, versus Nobuaki Kakuta, the powerful K1 ref Tom Glanville, who did a few EFC shows, versus Masaki Miyamoto, and 2 other matches, one of which features former Rings wrestler Mitsuya Nagai. The June 20th K1 Braves in Fukuoka with Bernardo vs. Sam Greco as the main event in their first ever meeting, plus Ernesto Hoost, Cepho and Matt Skelton will appear. The May 14th Mass Destruction pay-per-view from Lowell, Massachusetts had a few pro wrestling ties. Kevin Rosier, who lost to Satoru Sayama in the first UFO show, lost via 10th round knockout to Mike Labrie. Rick Rufus, who won the K1 American tournament last year, beat Stan Longinides with a 9th round knockout, and the first person he thanked after winning was Bill Goldberg. Beck also challenged Don Wilson, who won the main event at the age of 44 in his first match back an 8-year layoff from competitive kickboxing.
I'd see where Wilson did well since he's got a gift of gab and he came in shape. But fighting isn't kind to men who take on top-flight challengers at that age. Wilson agreed to face Rufus if the promoters would put it together, but somehow I don't see that happening. The ISCA did an ESPN2 Strike Force taping on May 15th in San Jose before a near sellout of about 5,000 fans, who were there largely to see Kung Lee and his amazing wrestling takedowns. Unfortunately, Lee's opponent, Scott Shealy, suffered a dent in the side of his head and the match had to be stopped early in the second round. People were pissed as even though Lee was the big draw, they wanted to see his flashy moves and just figured him winning was a given, I guess. It was really a terrible crowd reaction to what appeared at first, until you actually saw the dent in the guy's temple up close, to be a premature stoppage and basically the entire place emptied out even though there were a few matches left on the show. If anyone finds out when this will air, I do need to recommend the Jean-Claude Luyar vs. Andre Dudko match for the ISCA World Super Heavyweight title, as it was an amazing performance by both. Luyar eventually knocked Dudko out, which more closely resembled the fight scenes in the first Rocky movie, with both guys out on their feet and somehow continuing than a sporting event. Anyway, if you think the title picture in boxing is screwed up, you won't believe kickboxing.
On the May 14th pay-per-view, every fight was billed as for the World Championship of some organization, and in San Jose, basically every fight was billed as for some kind of ISCA title. They kept bringing out this belt that said ISCA United States middleweight title, and whomever won their fight and for whatever title it was billed as being for, they just brought out the same cheesy-looking belt. In the ISCA alone, which is one of about a zillion governing bodies, there are 20 weight classes, each of which has 4 different ISCA world titles because they break the titles up into full contact, Oriental rules, Muay Thai, and freestyle. In the ISCA ratings, there are a lot of K1 guys, as you'd figure, as those are the cream of the crop of heavyweight kickboxers in the world, although the rankings make no sense since, as an example, Bernardo is ranked number 7 and Sadake number 2, yet Bernardo always waxes Sadake when they fight. Boost is ranked as a super cruiserweight. Pro Wrestling or NHB names I've noticed were Rosier at number 12 in the super heavies, Lee Hasdell, Rings, at number 11 heavyweight, Igor Vovchinchin, Pride, at number 7 in heavyweight, Maurice Smith as Oriental Rules World Heavyweight Champion, Bob Schreiber, Rings, at number 15 cruiserweight, and Orlando Vite, UFO, as Oriental Rules World Super Middleweight Champion. Dan Severn was back in the NHB world on May 14th, beating Ross Kwan in Rapid City, South Dakota with a facelock submission. John LeVay vs. Yoshiki Takahashi was signed for the June 11th Pancrase show at Korakuen Hall, ECW. This week's TV was from last week's ECW Arena show. They then picked up the Chris Condito Taz angle in progress. Chetty was already on the stretcher and Condito looked apologetic, and then attacked him. Taz then made the save, then also attacked Chetty, saying that if he'd do that to his own cousin, imagine what he'd do to someone he hated. Sort of made no sense. Tammy was looking almost like Courtney Love in the final scenes in that Larry Flynt movie. Lance Storm and Justin Credible did an interview claiming that since New York suspended Sabu's license, that all the other states have followed in line like they did for Mike Tyson, and that Sabu can't wrestle anywhere in the country. Kind of hokey, since everyone pretty well knows most states aren't regulated at all, and even if they were, nobody cares about the health of wrestlers. I guess it made more sense than most WCW angles. Little Guido beat Mosco, DeLummer said. They were repackaging Guido as a tough little guy trained by Billy Robinson as sort of a shoot-style guy to work against the high-flying small guys, as opposed to his largely comedy role in the old FBI. Of course, this was a total style clash on paper since Mosco only knows lucha, but it wasn't too bad. Sally Graziano did his interfering. Guido did a really cool-looking powerbomb off the top rope. The fake crowd noise being piped in was really distracting as opposed to enhancing. It seems so 70s when you see fans not making noise and you have this whirring fake crowd noise that doesn't match the moves of the match. Guido won that with crab. Next was Takamichi Inoku and Yoshihiro Tajiri beating Super Crazy and Spike Dudley, who replaced Nova, who was destroyed early on by Guido and Sally. Nova is always billed from Silicon Valley, which begets the question. Does that mean he's from San Jose, California, or does that mean he's from the fantasy location where wrestling finds all its women? Tajiri was mad at Guido for interfering in his match as an attempt to build a little heat for the pay-per-view match and subsequent matches. When Nova was taken out, Spike came in. Taka must be tiny because he was even smaller than Spike. Highlight was Taka and Tajiri doing simultaneous Asai moonsaults. It was the weekly 3.5-star match out of ECW TV. Taka used the Michinoku driver on Crazy for the pin,
which was setting up Crazy getting the win back on the pay-per-view. The last match was edited like crazy, which was Dudley's beating Axel Rotten and Balls Mahoney, which was the angle to get rid of Rotten. Signed guy Lou D'Angeli finally spoke.
They only show the very beginning with some brawling that wasn't good.
They picked up right at the finish and showed the fireball missing badly and then doing the 3D on Mahoney for the pin. ECW is now on Fox Sports West #2 at 10 p.m. Saturday nights. Heyman expects to run a show in Manhattan in July at the Manhattan Center's 2,300-seat ballroom. WCW.
The only matches known for the June 13th Great American Bash pay-per-view from Baltimore are Nash vs. Savage for the WCW title, Piper vs. Flair for the presidency of the company, and Raven and Saturn defending the tag titles against Page and Bigelow.
Page and Bigelow are getting the belt, so the long title program with Raven and Kanyon and Saturn as a free bird-like trio against the Horsemen has been cancelled. Nash was on The Tonight Show on May 14th and did well for himself, although his storyline made little sense. He talked about Goldberg issuing the challenge to Austin for $100,000 and said they knew all along Austin wouldn't accept.
The original idea was for Goldberg to go on the show to challenge Hart on May 12th as mentioned in last week's Observer, but Goldberg is banged up a little and probably more important at odds over wanting his deal renegotiated.
He also missed a Hollywood Squares taping and DDP took his place. It was moved to May 14th, and Nash ended up replacing Goldberg. They showed the clip of Hart attacking Goldberg, and Nash called Hart high maintenance and a whiner who doesn't want to work for our federation, so he challenged him to the match at The Tonight Show. He also had this story how he got the name Big Sexy, sort of crediting it to a conversation with his wife, so I guess he liked the way Austin came off when he credited his gimmick to his ex-wife. I guess that sounds a lot better than Terry Taylor took the name from a young Canadian wrestler who came up with it and gave it to him instead.
On the May 17th show, Leno was running down Hart to prepare the audience for Hart's appearance as a run-in from the audience to accept the challenge on May 18th for a May 24th match, an appearance that was also plugged on Nitro the previous night.
This would be built up on Nitro next week and take place in a wrestling ring set up in the parking lot of The Tonight Show in Burbank. Nash never explained why he was making the challenge and why Goldberg wasn't there, but Nash offered $250,000 if Hart could beat him. Jay Leno was laughing all the way through this to make sure nobody took any of this seriously, and laughed especially hard at the idea that Goldberg was actually injured.
When Leno brought up Nash bringing the $250,000 in cash for the match, Nash balked and said he's bring a cashier's check, which made Nash look bad.
In reality, Goldberg's leg was bruised, but not broken. He is scheduled to undergo arthroscopic knee surgery anyway on May 25th, but may do one more angle before then, and they are hopeful he'll be back for Bash at the Beach pay-per-view on July 11th in Fort Lauderdale, which would be against Hart since Hart should be okay by then as well, but that's considered only 50-50 at best at this point and may have to be pushed back until August. With Goldberg out, they are going to give monster pushes to Nash and Savage as the two big stars and try and get Nash over strong as the lead face to build possibly to something with Hogan, who would come back as a heel.
There was a full-page ad in USA Today on May 17th, largely a photo of Nash, described even internally as an embarrassment, as it didn't even have the starting time for Nitro listed.
WCW, with 2 weeks of lead time and trailing badly in the ratings, didn't even build up one match for Nitro, while WWF built up two mainline singles matches for Raw and Heat the previous night.
They are now also planning the World War III pay-per-view to be in Toronto. The original November 1st house show was cancelled and moved to a pay-per-view date, with Hogan as a heel against Hart, although any plans 2 weeks in advance, let alone months in advance, are all speculative at best.
Eric Bischoff told some of the wrestlers on May 17th before Nitro that they were going to focus the company around 10 wrestlers, who weren't named but are believed to be Hogan, Page, Savage, Flair, Nash, Hall, Sting, Hart, Piper, and Goldberg, all but Goldberg being past 40, and that everyone else would have to wait for their push. This is diametrically different from what just about everyone following the situation believes is the way to cure problems if such a cure exists. Bischoff, in a lengthy interview that aired on the first hour of Nitro that was largely meant as a shoot and amazingly admitted, while it's obvious, it's still amazing that it was admitted because I've never seen a wrestling company in history go on its television in the midst of a war, even a one-sided war, and practically admit to being on top and blowing it and now being number 2. The truth of the current situation, talked about the plan to bring things back, and the plan is to build everything around the old guys.
In particular, most of the 10 wrestlers to be focused around don't work house shows because they have limited date deals, so the house shows will continue to consist of 2 or 3 main event guys, Flair, Page, and sometimes Goldberg or Sting, and being filled in with guys like Benoit, Malenko, Saturn, Raven, Mysterio, and Conan who aren't going to get serious pushes, and then are being counted on to go on the road in semi-main events and make people want to pay to see live events. It is believed Bischoff talked with Hogan, who brought him to this conclusion that those guys are the money players and nobody else can draw money. At this point, only a few of those 10 still mean much because they've all had their knees clipped so many times. Bischoff even apparently told one of the second group wrestlers, the guys who need to be pushed for the future but never are, if not more, that they had tried to push the younger guys but the ratings had fallen and it didn't work. Everyone was trying to figure out when the period was when they tried to push the younger guys. Besides, if they did try to push the younger guys now, it would fail miserably for the short run because they've been buried for so long, but the idea is to have the patience to get them over, and the lack of that patience and worrying about Tuesdays now is the downfall and the guarantee that things won't change substantially in the foreseeable future. Charles Robinson suffered a bruised esophagus and a possible collapsed lung in the May 17th Nitro match, taking Savage's big elbow finisher. The bump is harder to take now because Savage is overly protective of his bad knee, which means the elbow lands with more force than ever before, and Robinson is about 145 pounds and he doesn't have the thick chest most wrestlers who take the move have. He was taken to the hospital after the match. Scott Steiner had back surgery this past week and won't be able to wrestle for a while, although he was in Nitro in Rick's corner, but if you notice, he went out with a shirt on. Booker T was also injured, and I guess that phantom angle on Nitro where he challenged Rick Steiner to a match and never came out for his match will be the storyline explanation of it. In more good news, they are going to start doing Piper's Pit on Nitro. Nitro on May 17th in Cedar Rapids, Iowa drew a sellout 5,676, 5,496 paying $109,010. The show opened with Robinson replacing Piper's name with Flair's as president. This wasn't exactly ever explained, but I guess Flair now won the match in St. Louis after all. C. Bischoff didn't have the right to overrule that one, but Nash is still the champ because ref Nick Patrick was the one who made the decision to restart the match. Migraine alert. Flair came out for an interview with Arn Anderson, Robinson and Asya. God, does that look bad, spelling it with a Y as in telling the world we have no idea what to do other than copy WWF. He said if Turner had a problem with him he'd get Jane Fonda to ride Space Mountain. No crowd reaction to that line, which shows in a rapidly changing society about Fonda's current name value. Flair announced the top matches on the show and called out Page. They indicated a new Flair/Page alliance. DDP said that he never cried over a finish, which I thought was hilarious. Anyway, he brought out Bigelow to be his backup. Bischoff did his long interview talking about dominating wrestling for 88 weeks, wasn't it 83? He basically admitted WCW wasn't number one but said they would be again. Too bad he didn't tell us how. He thanked Bill Shaw for giving him his break and putting him in Power in 1992. Anyway, we were 32 minutes into the show before a match hit the ring. Mysterio Jr. beat Evan Karagias in 2:12 with a Frankensteiner off the top. Karagias has a good look but he's really bad. Mysterio Jr. couldn't do a thing with him. The match was supposed to go 9 minutes but after 90 seconds they told the guys to go home and Mysterio Jr. wasn't exactly thrilled about that backstage. Flair was then backstage and told Buddy Lee Parker that everyone who runs a company pushes their kid and talked about Gagne, Watts and Von Erich. How come he didn't mention McMahon? So he was going to push his kid. He told Parker that when Arn gives the signal, you lay down for the figure four and Flair would make him an executive in the company. He brought out David Flair and Torrie Wilson. They made it clear that in storyline, Wilson slept with Rick so he'd promised to give David a push. Okay, that explains why Rick is pushing David after everything that went down. But explain why David now loves Rick again. The migraines are coming. David Flair beat Parker in 2:41 with a figure four. This was so bad. Fans were booing this, and not for the reasons they were supposed to. From what we're told, David hasn't even been training to be a wrestler at the power plant. Savage and Medusa beat Flair and Robinson when Savage pinned Robinson after the elbow. Crowd was into this match big time from start to finish. Gorgeous George was on crutches for a later angle. Flair was selling like crazy for Medusa. It got great pops as she'd beat him up and cradle him and he'd take all his bumps, but it was stupid. She also nearly killed Flair doing a backdrop. This was living proof that even today Flair could carry a broom. Piper did an interview that died a royal death. He was given a comedy routine to read 10 reasons Flair shouldn't be president. It wasn't funny and he knew it, and it never ended. Being wrestling fans, the only line that got over was Flair thinking Y2K had something to do with KY jelly. Bischoff came out to no reaction. Now in the storyline, Bischoff holds a prominent executive position in the company.
Anyway, Piper yelled at Bischoff, who kept apologizing, saying he'd do better. Savage came out. Now Savage was a heel, with his entourage wanting a title shot at Nash. Medusa kicked Bischoff. George hit Piper with his crutch and Savage pile-drove Piper before Nash made the save, and Nash left arm-in-arm with Piper, which had its own unintentional humor. Hawk, who had Chastity with him, went to a no contest in a hardcore match with David Finlay in 8:56. Knobbs ran in and beat up both guys. Knobbs has an injured foot from his match with Bigelow, and Bigelow has a separated shoulder, which is why they are just doing run-ins. Fans really hated the finish, or lack thereof. Boy, they should judge Raw by the same standards if that's the case. When Booker T didn't come out, he was supposed to be jumped during his interview by Luger and suffer a knee injury since his knee is in rough shape again and he needs time off. But apparently Luger talked Nash out of having him do it, so they had to create a phantom angle that we didn't see. Rick Steiner challenged anyone for the TV title, and Sting came out. They did a double count out in 3:57, which was pretty hot.
Scott interfered and Lex Luger made the save. So what was Luger's big announcement a few weeks ago?
Kurt Hennig beat Connon in 13:02 with a fisherman suplex after interference from Savage.
This match epitomized everything wrong with WCW aside from the ring work.
Hennig worked very hard, as did Connon, and it was a really good arena match but not a good TV match because of its length.
Hennig is a better worker than Connon, but Connon is so much hipper and more over, and these are the kind of guys he needs to be beating, and they just cut him off every time. The Savage deal interference loss would be okay if they were building a program with those two and Connon gets elevated beating Savage, but you know that isn't going to happen either. Raven and Saturn kept the tag titles, beating Benoit and Malenko in 16:45, a very good match. Anderson hit Raven with a tire iron.
Malenko was on the top, but Kanyon shoved him off and he landed on Saturn's shoulders, who dropped him with the DVD for the pin. Raven, Saturn and Kanyon had words with Bigelow after the match to build for the tag title change. Finally, Nash beat Page via DQ in 6:24. To show how over these two guys are, besides the obvious 2.4 rating, the crowd was chanting Goldberg while watching a world title rematch. Bigelow interfered freely. Page worked hard enough to even get a good match out of Nash. Bigelow's interference meant nothing, but when Savage ran in, it was a DQ. Bigelow splashed Nash after the match and Savage put lipstick on his mouth and face. A few fans hopped the rail, and one got in the ring. Luckily for WCW, it's always the skinny guys who get past security. Savage tackled him and held him down without hurting him. Savage dropped the elbow on Nash and left him laying.
There were no Nitro girls on the show because they were on the Bruise Cruise. The fans weren't happy because that's part of the live Nitro experience, but the wrestlers were, as the Nitro girls usually practice their routines in the ring before the show, which doesn't allow the younger wrestlers as much time to work out their matches when they know them ahead of time in the ring.
Power plant wrestler Brett Hamner is the guy who has the brief cameo as superstar Billy Graham in the Ventura movie.
Goldberg was on WEI radio in Atlanta and said that Flair was as old as his father and needed to retire, and that Hogan, Savage and Piper needed to step aside as well, which appears to show his frustration is no different than anyone else's. The episodes of Suddenly Susan with Hogan drew 6.6 and 5.3 ratings, the first being average for the show and second being well below average. The fad of wrestlers being on shows giving a big boost to the ratings appears to be fading. Even if it wasn't, Hogan isn't the guy who it would work with today anyway.
ABC in New York ran a 5-minute puff piece on Goldberg, calling him the most popular wrestler in the world and showing football footage. Lismark Jr. broke his ankle on May 12 in Springfield, Missouri.
The May 20th Thunder show was taped on May 13th, as the live show was preempted due to the NBA.
Neither Bischoff nor Nash were at the tapings, which didn't exactly go unnoticed. Bischoff was at a major convention in Los Angeles, but that still didn't stop people from asking when the last time was that Vince McMahon missed a TV taping. They first did 5 dark matches with Hawk over Mike Enos, Ernest Miller over Supercolo with interference by Sonny Wanu, Vampiro beat Silver King, Connon beat Hugh Morris, and La Parka beat Dandy.
For the show, Rick Steiner over Scott Putski, Billy Kidman over Juventud Guerrera. Mysterio Jr. kept the Cruiserweight title, beating Kaz Hayashi in what we were told was a real good match. Savage and George beat up Mysterio Jr. Kidman and Connon put the lipstick on Mysterio Jr. Raven and Saturn kept the tag titles, beating Vincent and Horace. David Flair beat Barry Horowitz. Disco Inferno no contest Hennig when Savage ran in and Bagwell made the save, leading to a Savage vs. Bagwell main event, which wound up with a double count out as an angle involving injuring Nick Patrick.
Wrestling with Shadows tied for Best Feature Film at the 6th Annual Hot Docs Awards in Toronto last week. It also won for Best Independent Canadian Film. It has won awards at almost every festival it has been presented at, and was invited to a screening at the festival in New York on June 5 for the Best 15 Independent Films of the past year. Hogan has a TNT movie called Assault on Death Mountain, a sequel to Assault on Devil's Island which airs on June 8. The movie First Daughter, that Page filmed in Australia when he was doing the Injury Deal, airs on TBS on August 15.
The famous rapper Master P wants to get involved with pro wrestling with either WCW or WWF.
The HBO series Airless will be filming a segment this week involving wrestling which involves a Page vs. Savage match announced by Mike Tenay and Tony Schiavone, and Bischoff will also be on the show. The only wrestlers on the Bruise Cruise this week were Sonny Wanu, Disco Inferno, Kaz Hayashi and Chris Jericho on the first half, and Raven, Saturn and Kidman on the second half. WCW announcer Scott Hudson is getting married on May 22. House shows this week saw May 11th WCW Saturday night tapings in Cape Girardeau, Missouri drew 3,486, paying $67,443. May 12th in Springfield, Missouri drew a sellout 2,965, paying $72,837. May 13th Thunder in Wichita, Kansas drew 6,306, paying $133,006. May 14th in Des Moines, Iowa drew 6,876, paying $140,461. May 15th in Omaha, Nebraska drew a sellout 6,685, paying $134,941. And May 16th in Sioux City, Iowa drew 3,651, paying $78,390.
Springfield was headlined by a three-way with Sting over Page and Flair with Booker T over Bryan Adams in the semi.
Des Moines, Omaha, and Sioux City, reported as good shows, were headlined by Sting over Flair and Mysterio Jr. and Kidman beating Malenko and Benoit. We don't have complete merchandise figures for the week, but based on what we do have, it was going at the $6.74 per head rate. WWF.
The taped Raw from Fort Lauderdale, Florida from May 11th was a really hot show, even above the usual standard because they added hot in-ring action to the storylines. Also, this was the first week where Jim Ross' voice showed virtually no trace of his illness. They had 3 really strong matches with great crowd heat. All 3 didn't have finishes, but we can't get too greedy. X-Pac and Road Dogg and Kane versus Billy Gunn and Brown and Henry wound up with everyone brawling in the crowd. That name meat sounds even more lame when it's being used to call someone in a match. Actually, the mechanics in the ring between Meat and Test were really solid considering how limited in experience both guys are, but they were green at working the crowd. That DQ finish where Jacqueline hit a dropkick off the top on Test came off really lame. They seemed to tease that Tori would wind up with Test. I just realized watching the show that Paul Bearer is Joel Gertner in 25 years.
Brood vs. Michael Hayes, called by that name and not Doak Hendricks, and Hardy Boys was shockingly good, in particular Christian, Edge, who looked by far the best he's looked since coming to the WWF, and the Hardy Boys, who were given a new look and were really great. The Al Snow segment with Pierre the One-Eyed Deer Head had about 20 seconds of funny material in a several-minute-long funeral skit. By the time they talked about the One-Eyed Deer loving Sammy Davis Jr. tapes, I was begging for Holly to show up and put this skit out to pasture. Austin vs. Triple H was the best Triple H has looked in a long time, and Austin took crazy bumps all over and around the table. It was one of those deals where the symbol lowered and the match ended. The Sable Deborah title change was exactly as weird as it looked on television. There have been a lot of problems between Sable and management, to the point some think it's inevitable that Sable is going to leave and try to market herself as Rena Mero. She can't take the Sable name with her if she leaves the WWF in Hollywood. The reality is, if she does leave and goes by the name Rena Mero, her shelf life in Hollywood is very short. Right now she's major in demand as the flavor of the month because she can do business, sell magazines or draw ratings because of her popularity with wrestling fans who will cross over, but that'll be gone 6 to 9 months after she's off weekly television. WWF has to put up with her and she has to put up with them right now because they own her name, and she's become this ridiculously hot property for them for no reason other than being in the right place at the right time because it sure isn't talent. There's the second Playboy spread and yet another TV Guide cover already agreed on. Since her contract isn't to be a wrestler, she's refused to wrestle at house shows. She turned down doing the job in wrestling matches to give up the title on a few occasions and was making fusses about wrestling on television at all. She was agreeable to wrestling on pay-per-view shows because of the money involved, but didn't want to take bumps anymore. This pretty well left them to come to this ridiculous compromise in order to get the belt off her.
Even that wasn't executed as planned, as it was supposed to take longer before she tore Deborah's dress off, although she did know going in she was dropping the title in that scenario.
WWF The Music fell to number 67 this past week, selling 23,005 copies. Steve Austin and Deborah are featured together this week in George Magazine. A press conference is scheduled for June 25 to announce the October 11 Nitro date at the Georgia Dome. At a house show on May 12 in Tallahassee, Florida during the Mankind and Shamrock vs. Acolytes match, Mankind played heel when faced with Farouk, since that's where Ron Simmons was a college football hero and borderline legend at Florida State University. Mankind got on the house mic and said he was going to give Simmons something he didn't get in 4 years in college, and that's an education. Fans were doing the Seminole chop during Simmons' match. Austin and Jeannie Clark's divorce became final on May 17. She got custody of the kids and the financial split was said to be 50-50. There were a lot of tabloid stories on the divorce sensationalizing it, although a lot of the info came directly from the divorce papers. Entertainment Tonight did a TV feature this past week on the women of the WWF, and it was pretty clear that WWF was trying to market Deborah ahead of Sable in the piece. The Nash Bridges episode with Austin did an 8.2 rating and a 14 share on May 14. The previous 2 weeks had done 7.7 and 8.0s respectively, so it was an increase over the usual number. The show was promoted much harder than the previous 2 weeks and was the final episode of the season, so the rating for the show without Austin probably would have been about the same, unlike Austin's first appearance that drew the 9.8. Rock wasn't wearing a cast on his left arm at the house shows this week. Regarding Ed Ferreira, Vince Russo's assistant at script writing on Raw, he did give 2 weeks notice on May 10th at tapings after a dispute with Vince McMahon about a beaver cleavage vignette where they kept doing plays on the word pussy, and I guess even McMahon has his limits and wouldn't allow it to air, unlike this week talking about Big Hairy Beaver. At the time McMahon said he wouldn't accept his notice and wanted him to stay.
Not sure exactly what the status of him is, but it is believed he's staying.
Sunday Night Heat debuts on May 30th in Canada on Sportsnet, which is a rival station to TSN, which carries Raw.
WWF will be holding a press conference in Canada on May 28 to kick off hype for the show. In the U.S. News and World Report story on McMahon, which those who know McMahon better than I do also seem to believe is largely fabrication, the story about McMahon walking around so much in his early days as promoter that he put cardboard in his shoes was apparently an old wrestling tale about Nick Gulas.
Super Crazy worked the last Super Astros tapings under a Mosco mask using his WWF ring name of Super Loco. McMahon had a meeting with TSN executives on May 12 in Toronto, actually just outside Toronto, to talk about the content of Raw and where the show would be going.
Raw is being investigated by the CRTC, similar to the FCC in the US, even though TSN heavily edits the show. CRTC is most concerned because Raw airs at 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesdays, and also because TSN doesn't have a staggered feed, so the show airs on Monday nights at 6 p.m. on the West Coast.
You can already see many aspects of Raw toned down as far as graphic, really tasteless stuff, and they are mainly going for double entendre humor. Business for the week saw the Raw taping on May 11th in Fort Lauderdale draw a sellout 13,402, paying $332,402. May 12th in Tallahassee drew 8,203, paying $203,190. May 13th in Hershey, Pennsylvania drew 7,183, paying $190,896. May 14th in Philadelphia drew 16,316, paying $393,370. May 15th in Baltimore drew a sellout 12,020, paying $284,465, and May 16th in Richmond, Virginia drew a sellout 10,712, paying $267,890.
Tallahassee and Hershey had the main crew with the exception of X-Pac, not sure why, but it may be because his contract calls for a maximum number of dates per month. Austin and Undertaker, who are generally given midweek shows off to Rock over Billy Gunn, was the main event.
Philadelphia was a complete crew with Austin and Big Show and Rock over Undertaker and Triple H and Bossman when Austin stunned Bossman on top with X-Pac back but Jeff Jarrett off, given the weekend off. Baltimore and Richmond were split shows because most of the top names went to the UK for the pay-per-view. So those shows were headlined by Rock over Bossman and Big Show over Henry in a body slam match, and to fill out the cards they used people like DOA, Prince Albert, Kurt Angle, and Terry Taylor.
Reports on Angle versus Taylor were anything but positive. Reports all week in every city were that the Hardy Boys versus Too Much matches, which were openers at most of the shows, were the best match every night. Originally the LOD was to be booked on these shows, and with a split crew them not being used pretty much seems to indicate they aren't going to be used for the foreseeable future.
Merchandise for the week was $408,270 or $6.02 per head.
The April issue of Plugged In, which is a family-oriented magazine, had a cover story called Pro Wrestling's Headlock on Teens. Even though the story was almost entirely about WWF, it put Hogan on the cover.
The story was totally negative. Its version of history was nearly totally inaccurate as well. It said that in the 80s, the WWF was the only pro wrestling organization in the United States. I just love how history gets rewritten. Then in the early 90s, Ted Turner created WCW. It said McMahon responded by escalating sex and carnage to compete, and called the WWF the unscrupulous competitor of WCW. The article said both shows slammed traditional morality and noted their disrespect toward women at house shows. It concluded that years from now, when a man degrades a woman or bystanders turn a blind and desensitized eye toward public brutality, nobody at that time will point a finger at Undertaker, the NWO, or Stone Cold Steve Austin, but maybe they should. In Richmond, Rock slammed Boss Man outside the ring, grabbed a camera from a fan and took a picture, and gave the fan back the camera. On the sports home video charts this week, WWF occupied positions 1 through 13 with Austin in the top 2 spots. The highest non-WWF was Goldberg at number 14. The May 12th Hollywood Reporter ran a story specifically on the record Raw ratings of 2 days earlier. The second hour of Raw drew more viewers on average than Moby Dick, which was the most watched show previously in the history of the USA Network, which is where that most watched show stat comes from. The average for the 2 hours of 8.1 was just shy of the 8.2 that Moby Dick did for an entire night, but the 8.42 seconds hour beat the 8.2 of Moby Dick, so that highest rated show in the history of the network is comparing apples with oranges. It was the most watched episode of a regularly scheduled series in history of cable TV. Even though Raw is only on in 76% of the country, it still drew more males 18 to 34 than anything in its time slot, as Fox's Ally McBeal drew 2.03 million in that demo to just under 2.1 million for Raw. Its 18 to 34 viewership just in cable homes would have been enough to be number 8 for the week among network primetime shows, and its 12 to 34 numbers would have ranked number 6 in that demographic among network primetime shows, despite the network shows being available in about 22 million more homes. WWF also took out a quarter-page ad that was far more effective than WCW's full-page ad on May 17th, saying how the WWF slam dunked the NBA on TNT, noting its 8.1 rating to basketball's 1.2 rating in opposition. The readers' pages. Rude. While the opening graphic commemorating Rick Rude and 3-bell salute by WCW was a tasteful display by an industry that seldom is, I can't help feeling the company should have gone further out of its way to tribute a fallen star. Aside from Rude being a legitimate influential figure during most of his career, just turn on ECW to see Shane Douglas rip off Rude's Cut the Music line. He was under contract to WCW at the time of his death. I can't imagine that if a veteran star for the New York Yankees died during the season, the team would do no more than a quickie graphic and then never acknowledge that player again during its telecasts. So what if Rude hadn't been on television for a while? That was no different than a baseball player that was on the DL. Just because he hadn't been prominent lately doesn't change the fact that he worked for WCW and should have at least gotten a video package and proper respect from the announcers and the company as a whole. Rude may not have been the greatest worker, but in his prime he was heads and shoulders above most, and had memorable matches and feuds. His interviews and heel persona were textbook and should be required viewing for all up-and-coming wrestlers, many of whom think playing heel is about getting themselves over as a face. His feuds with Ultimate Warrior and Jake Roberts drew crowds and left lasting impressions for any wrestling fan that grew up during that era. He also showed great psychology in the ring, often making up for lame opponents by his facials and dramatic selling of moves, particularly the atomic drop. As a fan, I will miss him, and remain confused by WCW and WWF's tepid reaction. Once again, it seems that an industry that cares only about what have you done for me lately turned its back on another star whose death came prematurely. Paul Armentano. Silver Spring, Maryland. Response from Dave Meltzer. On Thunder on April 22, Mike Tenay and Larry Zbyszko gave a brief mention of Rude's death in commentary. WWF did a nice video package on Superstars, which WCW should have also done. The difference between baseball and wrestling in their respective reactions is that active baseball players don't die with anywhere near the frequency of active wrestlers, and because baseball is put under such a heavier microscope by the media that it can't run away from its problems, while wrestling attempts to. Spending too much time on Rude's death might bring up questions that nobody wants to address in wrestling because they know the answers, like what he may have died from, and why so many wrestlers die so young.
Rick Rude vs. Jerry Lawler was the main event on the first live wrestling card I ever went to on June 28, 1984.
I got to see Rude a few more times over the years and was always entertained. I attended Halloween Havoc in 1991 and was screaming out who the Phantom was to the chagrin of those around me. Losing him and Jos LeDuc in a couple of weeks has really made me miss the old Memphis television shows. I remember after your part on Outside the Lines that some idiot on one of those wannabe insider websites claimed you were exaggerating the body count in wrestling, and that only Spicoli and Pillman were active in the Big Two at the time of their death. I guess Rude doesn't count either.
I guess this is how others in the business rationalize that there really isn't a problem in their company.
Maybe the problem isn't steroids. It seems that the chemicals the guys are using today make steroids look like aspirin. Tracy Byers, Nashville, Tennessee. Loved your story on Rick Rude.
I was lucky enough to be a WWF ring announcer from 1983 to 1992. Rick used to do his routine.
After turning down and insulting 3 local women, he would pick my wife and invite her into the ring.
My wife would turn down the Rude Awakening and the crowd would love it.
The story brought back some great memories. Teddy Nisenbaum, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Contracts. I know you've probably gone over this before, but can you explain the general pay structures within the WWF and WCW?
I understand that WCW offers guaranteed contracts and pay while injured, while WWF usually offers a downside guarantee.
How is the WWF wrestler's pay calculated against downside guarantee? For example, I understand Rock has signed for a downside guarantee of $500,000.
How much does he actually gross, and how is that figured? I've heard from other sources that Triple H signed for a downside guarantee of $700,000. Why would he have a better contract than Rock?
After seeing how WCW mid-card wrestlers like Steve Austin, Mick Foley, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash became stars in WWF, why would Chris Benoit re-sign with an organization that has buried him for the past 3 years? What is the general pay scale for mid-carders or jobbers, ECW stars and independent stars?
I recently read the article on pro wrestling and salaries in Forbes magazine where it was compared with other sports where athletes receive anywhere from 35 to 50% of revenues, and the wrestlers received 1 to 2% of revenues. What is the best contract you've ever heard of a wrestler receiving?
Aaron Goff, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Response from Dave Meltzer. All contracts are different. Most WCW contracts are for a basic amount each year, and there can be additional income for merchandise and licensing in some deals. Some have a maximum number of dates built into the contract per year. Hulk Hogan's deal includes a percentage of the gate of the pay-per-view shows and house shows he works, along with a $25,000 guarantee for every appearance on Nitro. His contract is probably on paper the best contract any full-time wrestler has ever received, although Steve Austin may have earned more money than Hogan last year due to t-shirt sales. The best contract I've ever heard of was Dennis Rodman's deal last year. He earned a base pay of $1.5 million plus a percentage of all revenue above $5 million on the Bash at the Beach show, so he earned a minimum of $2.25 million for that one show.
To show the nerve of Rodman, but what the hell, they know what they were dealing with when they signed him, just like the Lakers. For that money he no-showed the Georgia Dome before the Record House for the final angle to build to the match, showed up at the match in no condition to perform and had one of the worst matches you'll ever see, and then sued WCW because last year he earned a percentage of all monies on pay-per-view above $3.9 million and it was switched in the new contract to $5 million, and he claimed he didn't know about the switch and was wanting another $500,000 from the show. WWF contracts basically offer a downside guarantee that the wrestler will make X amount of dollars at the end of the year. Some wrestlers sign $250,000 downside guarantees that they will make $5,000 per week, but I believe those are the minority.
Most wrestlers get paid based on house show and pay-per-view revenue, and in the case of the biggest stars, get a merchandise cut. What exactly the percentages are is something nobody truly knows. My impression is there is no formula, other than Vince McMahon allocates a certain percentage of house show revenue, and a certain percentage of pay-per-view revenue going to talent, and Jim Ross then is put in the position of carving that money up, and McMahon eventually signs off on it. Wrestlers in both WWF and WCW receive far more than 1 to 2% of total revenue. In WCW, the figure is probably 19%, and in WWF it's closer to 13 to 15% as compared to other sports where it ranges more than double and in some cases triple that amount.
The consensus of those in the WWF that are in contact with me is that they like working there, but many question the payoff scale because in 1998, when business was better than any time in history, the wrestlers, at least in many cases, didn't earn much more than their downside guarantees, which were supposed to be what they would earn under a worst-case scenario.
I don't know the specifics of Rock's contract versus Hunter's contract, although I'm sure Rock in his position, no matter what his downside is earning well over $1 million per year.
Benoit was given a better financial deal by WCW, more money for less dates.
WWF was more of a risk.
If they liked him and pushed him, he could have come out ahead in the long run. There is no guarantee of that because they don't like short wrestlers there, and being a great worker is no guarantee of success in the United States, and if they decide he's not a good interview, they won't write him into their stories.
He could have been made into a much bigger star like the names you mentioned, but keep in mind none of the names you mentioned were 5'8.5", and the WWF has never built its company around anyone that's 5'8.5". Not to say someday there won't be a first, but you have to look at the fact it's never been done, and it isn't as if some exceedingly talented smaller guys have come through their doors and not gotten that far. He could have been working openers with no story and working far more dates for far less money. The bottom line as I see it is that a wrestler has to look at which company wants them more, and because it's wrestling, not says they want them more but shows they want them more on paper. In most cases, that's the company that is willing to make the financial investment in them, particularly right now when both companies can afford to sign anyone they want bad enough. WCW put it on paper and WWF didn't. That doesn't mean Benoit didn't make a mistake, and we'll never know what could have been. Drugs in wrestling.
I'm writing because I don't understand your perspective in being so critical of wrestling promoters' apparent unwillingness to seriously address the problems with wrestlers' drug abuse.
First, I personally despite drug use of any kind, and agree that use by wrestlers, and the high death rate in recent years, is a significant problem. But my belief is that the root of the problem is the wrestlers themselves, and the irresponsibility and very poor judgment of those wrestlers who take drugs. How dare a family man like Brian Pillman show so much disrespect and lack of responsibility toward his family to choose a lifestyle that would end his life at such an early age, and leave his family alone to cope without him. The death of Brian Pillman and others was not the fault of Vince McMahon or Eric Bischoff. It was Pillman's fault and nobody else's. By looking for a scapegoat, as I believe you are doing, you are in many ways vindicating the stupidity of so many of today's wrestlers, and validating the twisted reasons they can come up with to justify their own personal choices. I think that's very dangerous. Drug testing by an employer in most businesses is typically done to protect the employer, not the employee. It's designed to identify reasons for actual or potential poor job performance, and allow an employer to terminate a problem employee. In sports, drug testing is also designed to eliminate the unfair advantage competitors can obtain with performance-enhancing drugs. In none of these cases outside wrestling is drug testing designed to allow the employer to act as big brother and to protect the employee from their personal demons.
So why should pro wrestling promoters be held to a big brother standard? The challenge the wrestling promoter faces is that they know many of their star performers take drugs. If they fired or suspended everyone who failed a drug test, the vast majority of the stars would be gone. In other words, they would be hurting themselves considerably if they had a strict drug policy. This is the exact same situation faced by record companies in the music industry and many television and movie producers. The fine line the promoter faces, knowing the problems many of the stars face, and the need to continue to use those stars, is a potential public relations problem if the widespread nature of drug use in the business becomes well known. So the promoters have chosen to do some limited testing, and a lot of lying and exaggerating to the press, to help offset the downside if a problem were to erupt. In most businesses, employers are considered the victims of their employees' drug use, since it is disruptive to productivity and is a distraction that needs to be dealt with. When it comes to use of drugs like cocaine, I would also view the promoter as a victim of the abuse of the wrestlers if it causes problems with bookings and performance. I would not say promoters are victims of wrestlers' use of drugs like steroids, since clearly use of those type of drugs has been encouraged by promoters either directly or indirectly. Any public relations problem from those drugs were self-created by the promoters. But again, and I can't stress this enough, the ultimate choice to take any drug is that of the wrestler. To point the blame anywhere else is to miss the big picture, and not understanding the root of the problem. Many wrestlers are just plain idiots. Name withheld by request. Response from Dave Meltzer. Since employees dying doesn't appear to be a problem for the employers, and if it's not a problem for the employers that disrupts work,
How about when performers no-show dates or show up in no condition to perform and either screw up the matches or make matches more dangerous for their opponent?
Does that in some sense constitute a potential disruption at work?
The root of the problem, if you look at the big picture, are the people that drive the industry and create the standards of what you have to look like and what you have to do to be a star, and then everyone underneath copies that has dreams of being a star. That usually isn't the wrestler making the choices in 98% of the cases, as he's just trying to be what will make him money, but the people, whether it be promoters or fans, and what the top wrestlers have done to become big money wrestlers. Some wrestlers would be pillheads and roidheads even if they weren't in wrestling, even if it didn't benefit them financially, because that's just who they are and how they are, and the business has limited responsibility if they suffer eventual problems. But a lot became them directly because of the demands of the profession and because of the belief they were part of the necessities to make money and either feed their egos or feed their families or both.
To even entertain the thought that this style of pro wrestling, or pro football for that matter, could be performed day in and day out without painkillers is to not see the big picture, and to be any kind of a wrestling fan you can't be such a hypocrite and not accept that limited use of painkillers has to be acceptable.
And to ignore that by blanketly saying, drug use is wrong, wrestlers are idiots, and still be a wrestling fan is to rationalize things way beyond what I'm capable of doing.
There has to be enough care for employees at some level to at least attempt to keep use from becoming abuse, and clearly that system didn't work for Pillman, and I'm not pointing the blame at the WWF because they were aware and at least to an extent they tried. But I believe there's at least a chance, had he been under the old WWF drug testing program, he'd still be alive today.
Maybe not. It's not a question that can be easily answered, and the fact was, Louis Piccoli nearly died from an overdose while under the old WWF program, so drug testing is part of an answer, but I don't have a complete answer. Other than doing nothing while guys drop dead is the worst answer of all, and for all of what you say about it not being the responsibility of the employers, I don't believe that any pro sport, whether it be football, basketball, or baseball, faced with a death rate even close to that of pro wrestling at the major league level, would stand by and do nothing. In regard to drugs in wrestling, even if wrestlers would be honest about their problems instead of pretending they don't exist, they would still be crucified in the media. In 1992, the Hulk Hogan had said, "Yes, I do steroids," he'd have been buried immediately because he was a pro wrestler.
On the other hand, Brett Favre said he was addicted to painkillers and was treated like a hero.
Truth or lies, the world will always have double standards. Michael Burt, Las Vegas, Nevada. Response from Dave Meltzer. You're right about there being a double standard. There has never been one pro wrestler who voluntarily admitted doing steroids get buried by the media. Hogan may have been the exception had he done so because of the contradictions in marketing vitamins based on his impressive physique to children. Guaranteed, if Mark McGuire would have come out last season and said he was on steroids, not implying that he is or isn't, he'd have received 1,000 times the criticism Hogan would have in the same situation, even though Hogan was directly marketing vitamins to children through his physique. But in 1991, it appeared to me from the way things were phrased in the 1994 McMahon trial, this was never quite outright said, as Hogan avoided the issue that McMahon had suggested Hogan admit he used steroids on Arsenio Hall, and Hogan dug himself into a deeper hole by telling such a ridiculous lie that everyone in the profession knew about. Many people in wrestling expected the day before the show for Hogan to come out smelling like a rose by doing what was called by con men at that time, the Jimmy Swaggart defense. Ask for forgiveness and pretend to be sincere, not to mention being totally insincere about it and continuing to do the same thing.
If anything, because pro wrestling is under so much less media scrutiny than the NFL, a football player is going to get far more heat for a drug label.
Who got more bad pub for getting a DUI, Scottie Pippen or Juventud Guerrera? And granted, that's not a fair comparison because one is a bigger star than the other, and also because one was trying to escape being caught. But an NBA player of comparable talent to Guerrera would get 50 times the bad pub Guerrera got,
which was basically no bad pub at all.
Favre is actually a very good example of something.
He was arguably the best player in the league at the time this went down.
The league tested him every week not only for painkillers, which were legal, and alcohol, which was legal and both of which were prevalent in his profession, but also for the regular illegal drugs.
And he was maybe the best player in the league, and he didn't like being tested weekly for alcohol at all and complained publicly about how restrictive his punishment was. There are many pro wrestlers who have had problems with drugs and admitted to it or lied about it and got caught. Not one has ever had to go through the rigors of proving himself to be as clean as Favre had to, and on a weekly basis, to stay in the game.
Sean Waltman, whose problems at their peak were probably worse than Favre's and has admitted as much and turned his life around, was basically a mid-level guy in WCW after being released by WWF because his problems were getting out of hand. He didn't run from his problem and went to rehab.
Scott Hall and Brian Pillman were routinely crashing rental cars, a level Favre never came close to, and they were never put under constraints anywhere close to Favre or put under pressure by the media like Favre was. This idea that the media picks on pro wrestlers and leaves football or baseball players alone because they are more established sports is the biggest joke of all. Until the last year, the media ran from pro wrestling, and now it embraces it to a point, but even today very few take it seriously, which is why the problems were allowed to get so bad in the first place. And even now its performers are held to far less scrutiny than athletes of less than half their popularity and notoriety in real sports. Whether this point is good or bad is not what I'm arguing, but I'm just pointing out the difference between the NFL and WCW. Waltman was never drug tested once in his entire tenure at WCW despite having a past filled with problems, nor put under any kind of constraints to stay totally clean of everything to stay in the game. Roller Jam. While I don't plan my television viewing around Roller Jam on TNN, and subsequently may not be as informed on Roller Derby's latest attempt, I have one overriding impression of the product. It's too slow. Way too slow. I don't know if it's due to the producers of the show valuing sex appeal and the ability to fill out a uniform over true athletic talent when making the rosters, the camera angles, which should be closer to the track as in auto racing when they put the cameras right up against the wall so you can really get the feel of how fast the cars are going, or the track being, in my opinion, way too big. It's probably a combination of all those and more. Roller Jam is like watching the old Olympic Auditorium Los Angeles T-Birds in slow motion. At least they don't settle ties with the help of a live alligator and have a figure-8 track, as another failed incarnation of roller derby did. Has anyone ever suggested a roller derby type promotion with an ice surface taking the place of a traditional track? I think the Winter Olympics for the most part are silly, but the one thing I, for whatever reason, am glued to is the short track speed skating, which just seemed to a layman like me to be roller derby on ice. I'm into it for no other reason that everyone is moving fast. For the generation of people that roller derby in its current form is aiming at, the worst thing it can be is boring. Boring many times is associated with slow. Roller derby on ice could work. You could still do the storylines and still dress the women up in semi-skimpy outfits and still have the same rules and still do the show from Orlando. The pool of talent to draw from would probably be a little smaller as my guess if fewer people ice skate than roller skate. Best of all, depending on the depth of the promoters' pockets, we could finally see, once and for all, Nancy versus Tanya in the ultimate match race. But most of all, it would be twice as entertaining, and isn't that the point, as the slow-plodding product out there now. Sean Flanagan. Los Angeles, California. WWF versus WCW. By the way, wasn't it the NWO angle and the star power of WCW that brought them to the top in 1996 and 1997? Your comments regarding the quote in the Philadelphia Daily News leads one to believe the young workers were the reason for WCW's past success. The great matches were part of the winning formula, but the WWF also couldn't compete with WCW's star power. WCW failed to elevate the younger guys who were getting over on their own without much help. Plus, the product really got stale from a storyline standpoint once the NWO angle had run its course. The WWF took over because Steve Austin got over big time and the feud with McMahon was hot as well, and then they elevated Foley, Helmsley, Rock and Shamrock and added several new faces, and the new direction with the new faces made the shows really fresh. It's not as if their in-ring product is the reason for their current success. The match quality today in WWF is nowhere near the quality of WCW of 1996 and 1997. Everyone seems to be discussing Wrestler of the Decade, but Mitsuharu Misawa is a relatively easy choice for me. The tough choice is Match of the Decade. It could think of probably 30 matches that are interchangeable, but a few stand out. Chris Benoit vs. Great Sasuke from the 1994 Super J-Cup tournament, Asia Kong vs. Manami Toyota from the Tokyo Dome and Misawa vs. Kenta Kobashi from January 20, 1997. Also, I never saw it reviewed in The Observer, but it's one of the best matches I've ever seen. Sasuke and Masato Yakashiji and Super Delphin and Gran Hamada and Gran Naniwa vs. Takamichi Noku and Dick Togo and Men's Teo and Shoichi Funaki and Shiryu from December 16, 1996. I believe this was from the Samurai TV opening night special. I'm almost certain you would give this match 5 stars since it was non-stop high spots with the crowd going nuts the entire match and tons of great near falls. Robert Gray. Benton, Illinois. Response from Dave Meltzer. There are so many great matches it's hard to pick one. It's funny because to me the best ones never won Match of the Year. The 1992 Mayumi Ozaki and Dynamite Kansai vs. Manami Toyota and Toshio Yamada match I think was better than their 1993 match that won top honors. A 60-minute draw with Kenta Kobashi vs Toshiaki Kawada from Osaka, which never aired on television, was the best 60 minutes match I ever saw, and there were a lot of Misawa and Kobashi vs Kawada and Taue matches as well, and a lot of Misawa singles matches with Kawada and Kobashi.
The Kyoko Inoue vs Manami Toyota 60 minutes match had more high spots but didn't build anywhere close to as well.
Toyota vs Yamada Hair vs Hair was the best match I've ever seen live. The best one-night performance to me was Sasuke at the first J-Cup doing 3 match of the year caliber bouts in one night against Samurai, Liger, and Benoit.
The 10-man you mentioned I thought was a 4 3/4 stars to 5 stars match, but I thought about 8 weeks earlier when MPW ran its Sumo Hall show that most of those same wrestlers were in another match that was even better. One thing I have to say as far as Nitro and Raw is Nitro, with its horrendous storylines, and Raw, with its mostly horrendous wrestling, have given me a great respect for Ally McBeal.
What's with Eric Bischoff's new gray hair and paunch?
I think he wants to look old enough to be a main event wrestler in his own company. Joe Urbanic. Elmhurst, Illinois.
With the absence of Nitro on May 10th, I finally got a chance to watch Raw all the way through.
I usually switch back and forth between the two shows.
The main observation I made was many of Raw's viewers must really be into his soap opera and women in little clothing because the wrestling sucked. For all the complaining about how bad the wrestling is on Nitro, and I'll be the first to admit they put on their share of crappy matches, I didn't see where the wrestling on Raw is any better.
Kane's entire offense against Mr. S consisted of 50 right hands. The Sable Deborah angle was all screwed up, and the main event with all the big names left a lot to be desired. Raw viewers must prefer style over substance and must like the skits.
Do you think the new show on UPN is going to lead to WWF overexposing itself?
One of the many problems WCW has, in my opinion, is the overexposure of its product. Eric Bischoff was right in trying to block the Thunder show, as the extra 2 hours of television every week watered down their product and many of their angles became stale. I feel the UPN show in the long run will only hurt the WWF, as it will expose their lack of talent depth, in addition to hurting the major angles, as the extra exposure will only water them down. Wesley Jones. Chesapeake, Virginia. Response from Dave Meltzer.
The new show will only overexpose the product if it's a bad show.
Sunday Night Heat wound up strengthening Raw and the product overall.
The one thing I've learned over the years in wrestling is that exciting television, no matter how plentiful, is rarely going to be a negative, but bad television, in the long run, will always end up being a negative, except in a non-competitive situation where, with nothing to compare it with, bad, as the only thing,
can become good. The glory days of the AWA come to mind.
There is 100 times as much sports on television as there was 20 years ago, but the overall health of the sports industry is far stronger.
All that free television hasn't kept people from going to the live events, and there is far more college football or pro football or baseball or basketball on television during the course of a week than pro wrestling. Page.
Regarding Diamond Dallas Page as an interim world heavyweight champion, in my opinion he's one of the best. Just examine a few.
Stan Stasiak, Ivan Koloff, Iron Sheik, Tommy Rich, Ron Garvin, Kevin Nash, Superstar Graham, Dusty Rhodes, and Ricky Steamboat. Other than Steamboat, who I feel would have to be high on anybody's list, DDP is way ahead of the others when it comes to ring work and interviews. Agreed, he may not have the longevity of these previously noted, but I'd compare his work to theirs any day. The guy deserves some credit. He's come a long way from running a septic tank business in New Jersey to driving a pink Cadillac, from a manager in the AWA to a headliner of major pay-per-view shows, to appearing on The Tonight Show. We should appreciate all this man has accomplished. Between coming up with the Nitro Girls gimmick, the theme restaurant, the reading book charity, I marvel at all that he has accomplished and will continue to root him on. Watching him in the ring with Ric Flair, Randy Savage, and Bret Hart, some of our generation's best performers, gives credence to the fact he's a local boy who made good. Second, besides attending pay-per-view shows, a second hobby of mine is collecting wrestling figures. It's noteworthy that for me, the passing of these stars, now on a regular basis, a shelf for those recently deceased had to be constructed. I hope I don't have to build any more shelves. Rich Kramer. Brick, New Jersey. Response from Dave Meltzer. As far as match quality, I'd rate Page ahead of all those you mentioned except for Steamboat. I wouldn't rate Page as an interview ahead of Graham, and for charisma he's well behind Graham and Rhodes. Title defenses on TV against Sting and Goldberg, which he carried and were the best matches either very hard and has had this year, and he doesn't get enough credit for all the work he does outside the ring promoting children reading. But based on the direction of the company and what should be the direction of the company, he was the wrong guy at the wrong time. Undertaker. For years, many of us hardcore fans have had a problem with Vince McMahon handing us this supernatural faked-out Undertaker character.
As angles and storylines become more based on real-life situations, there is Undertaker still doing the hocus-pocus black magic stuff.
But Vince thinks of everything.
Hold on, I gotta have a sip of my surge now that Undertaker is being pushed to the top. Vince tells us in one of his low-key interviews that Mark now believes that character that was created for him years ago. So now rather than asking us to believe he really is this Prince of Darkness voodoo character, now all we have to believe is that he's this David Koresh-like madman who buys into his own psychobabble, and has these followers who buy into it as well.
Brilliant. However, I've got one question for Vince.
Now that it's been admitted that Mark is just a character that was created by Vince, and has taken the act too far, explain Kane.
Lance Levine. Chokehold University. Response from Dave Meltzer. Kane is really Glenn. I think he was once the Unabomber.
As a child, he was in a fire that killed both his parents.
Except his real father was Paul Bearer, who raised him from the age of 9. Mark was also raised by Paul Bearer after his parents died in the fire.
However, even though they lived in the same house as children, Mark thought Glenn had died for 20 years until he showed up in St. Louis the day after Brian died.
Brian really died. Mark's parents really didn't. Nor did Glenn, nor did Mark really think Glenn died. He knew that was just a clever wrestling storyline. Nor did they live in the same house. Anyway, Glenn told Paul that Mark set the fire that never took place. Mark wanted to kill Paul for saying he murdered his parents because Glenn used to fool around with fires and was the one who set the fire.
Paul was having an affair with Mark's mom and was actually Glenn's father.
Mark wanted to kill Paul for that one.
Glenn and Paul set Mark on fire and slammed him into his mother's bones after they exhumed the grave.
Eventually Mark got so mad that they fought each other. But that was really a promotional stunt by Vince to draw a buy rate for WrestleMania, so Mark hated Vince. So because he hated him so much, he and Glenn got together to be his bodyguards. But they got yelled at because Vince was an ungrateful asshole, so they destroyed Vince's ankle.
Actually, that was because why? The same reason Paul White, Vince's top enforcer, turned face to get away from Vince being such an asshole, and because Rock was such an asshole and was back with him 2 weeks later, in the role of Vince's top enforcer and running in to help Rock.
Anyway, as it turned out, after spending a year fighting Glenn because he'd killed his parents, Mark admitted he was the one who killed his parents and burned his brother. And the police show up to arrest wrestlers every Monday, but nobody ever questions him.
And Paul loved those parents and Glenn, his son.
So now, Paul and Mark are back together with Paul. And Vince Russo and Ed Ferrara's attention to the minutest detail make them the greatest script writers on television. Women's title. In the December 14th issue of The Observer, my rankings of the WWF Women's Champions from the past 40 years was printed. It's time to update. My question is, how do I rank a woman's champion who has never had one match in her entire career? Ken Raftery. Staten Island, New York. Video walls. This letter is in regard to Ken Phillips' letter on video walls in the April 19th Observer. He maintained that because fans are preoccupied by seeing themselves and their signs on television, that this creates the lack of fan heat during the matches presented in front of them. I, on the other hand, think there is no correlation. Think about it. How are fans supposed to get excited during a match on Raw when most likely there is going to be a run-in and or the match won't go more than 2 or 3 minutes unless it's the main event? Thumbs up to Vince McMahon for finding a great way to make Raw hot by keeping things short, since most of the fans today are simply into wrestling because it's the in thing to be into and they've been educated only to pop for ring entrances, angles and tits. As for real wrestling fans, they're discouraged by the lack of time for matches, thus the lack of heat.
On Nitro, the matches are a little longer, but it's hard to get excited by a 10 minutes Vincent vs. Stevie Ray match, although they are moving a step in the right direction by having the 20 minutes luchador match on the April 19th show. Baseball, basketball, football and ice hockey all have video walls that are left on during the game. Does this hurt those sports?
No. It's the experience of attending an event, whether it be Raw, Nitro or a ball game, that excites fans, along with seeing good action. Don't even get me started about Thunder.
If anything, people seeing themselves on television would cause them to cheer and make even more noise, not quiet them down, so it should come across better on television if anything.
Peter Parota. Middletown, New York.